Welcome to the June 9th, 2021 Community Formation Commission. We will call the meeting to order at 5:34 p.m. And before we go to roll call, just a couple of announcements. The first being that I believe as of yesterday, we were able to complete the contract with NACOL. And so we have Cameron McElhinney here to support for any questions or feedback or support that we may need from NACOL tonight. In addition, we do have a few commissioners that are not going to be here with us today. It's going to be Commissioner Adamalikan, Commissioner Chavez, who's graduating from university, so congratulations to her. And then Commissioner Rodriguez as well. And Commissioner Harris is going to be here a little later. And yeah, so if there are no other questions or concerns, Mr. Ramirez, can you do roll call?
Sure. Commissioner Damo Adamalikan, absent. Commissioner Christian Alonso.
Here.
Commissioner Chavez, absent. Chair Escobedo.
Here.
Commissioner Harris is not here. Commissioner Kim Johnson.
Present.
Commissioner Rachel Johnson.
Present.
Commissioner Killebrew. Commissioner Jacob Lesnar Buxton.
You.
Commissioner O'Gorman. Commissioner Rodriguez. Absent. Commissioner Sander.
Here.
And Vice Chair Zepeda. I see her online.
Present. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, just confirming your attendance. Thank you, Vice Chair. Okay, that completes the roll call.
Okay.
Include Louisa and Lewis as well. We
Oh,
are here.
I apologize. Louis Reynaud
Here, sir.
and Louisa Wood.
Present.
I apologize for that.
All right. So before we go to the administrative agenda, we will go to public comment for items that are not on today's agenda.
Okay,
Mr. Ramirez, do we have anyone for public comment?
let me confirm. If there's anyone in the public that wish to address the commission on items that do not appear on the agenda, simply raise your hand in the chat feature of the app. Is there anyone wishing to address the commission? There are no requests to speak, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So that takes us to our next item, and we have two items for consideration and action. The first being the May 12th, 2021 community formation meeting minutes. You should have received those before the meeting. They're also online. And I'll give everyone a moment to take a look at those. And if there are no changes, is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
So moved.
So we have Commissioner Alonso with the first. Do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Wood, second. And any discussion on the item? Okay. Mr. Ramirez, can you do a voice vote?
Sure. The motion is to approve item A as presented. And just to confirm, you asked for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Against? Motion passes.
And item B for this item is the consideration of tentative timeline for the CFC. So this is the timeline with minor changes based on comments that we heard at the last commission meeting. Again, this, Mr. Ramirez, are you able to pull up this, the timeline?
Sure, just give me 1 second, Mr. Chair. Let me just make it larger. Let me know if that's
That's good.
That's great. So one of the few changes that we made, adding additional public outreach for the July to September timeframe. There was a desire from the commission based on comments to have initial outreach, get the feedback, and then go out for a second public outreach in that October to December range. Again, this, and then I added the note at the bottom because there were commissioners that were concerned about just making sure that we can maintain flexibility and that this wasn't binding in any way. And it's really not. It's more just to give City Council an idea of kind of what we're thinking. So that's more, it's just more informational. Commissioner O'Gorman?
Yeah, just, I guess I hadn't noticed that it was actually on the agenda, but because one of the things I was going to bring up is just, it'd be good if we all like had a chance to sort of brainstorm and give input, you know, without stuff being on a page, because sometimes, you know, that. So when I saw it last month, I guess it's pretty much similar. You made a couple changes, but I mean, I can think a lot of a lot of things, but we just haven't had that opportunity. And now we have a facilitator, you know, to really actually get input. I mean,
we can scrap this if that's what the commission wants to do, and just start from scratch. That's okay. Everything on here is from commissioner comments, and but I mean, I have no stake in this. It was more of just keeping City Council informed of what our progress is and where we plan to go. And I had always envisioned that this would be updated multiple times, and especially now that we have NACOL contracted with us, we would definitely use them as a resource to update it from this point moving forward. It was more of just, we have not had a chance other than City Council members who have watched the meeting to give them an update. So that was the idea.
well, I guess just to kind of give an example, when it says phase 1 of public outreach strategy development, I know one of the things I had thrown out there was, you know, the advantage of having a, you know, like a public workshop or something like that. So I don't know if those are things that once we get to where we talk about doing things, we can, you know, offer more input.
If I may, I think we're going to get that opportunity later today when the community engagement and outreach work group discusses, because that's kind of their purview is developing that strategy and talking about kind of what their vision is, and then getting our feedback later today. So this was supposed to be just kind of general, but again, if the commission wants to completely scrap this, I'm okay with that as well.
No, I don't want to completely scrap it. I just want us to be able to, you know, just have conversations about it and offer input on things that might not be on there. So that's all.
Yeah, that's fair. Any other comments, discussion, changes that you would like to see? Or if this is something that, Commissioner Wood?
The opportunity to ask Cami from NACOL to give her input, that might be a good next. Okay.
Absolutely.
Cami, would you mind looking at this and seeing if there's something from NACOL's perspective where we could be adding or?
Yeah, I can definitely take a look at it. I will say I applaud the fact that you've actually have this in writing so far, and that you have note at the bottom that essentially is that subject to change as it's a fluid document. But I can definitely take a look at the different phases and see if there's anything that we would add. But I think keeping it fair, this document fairly general is going to help you in the long run.
Yeah.
So that you, as new ideas come up, you have a place where you can put them and it's not so specific, you've already squeezed them out.
Thank you for that. Other commissioner questions or any sort of changes that you want to see? The idea, Commissioner Ken Johnson.
Oh yeah, I was just wanted to voice that I'm 100% in favor of having something like this, and I love, as everyone had said, the fact that it's a free-flowing document and that it continues to be updated. But I think having something that allows us to see how we can get to an end and sort of chunk everything up over the months, I think is valuable for us.
Thank you. Other comments? And I'll just add before any other commissioners go, is that the idea would be that we would, if there's any changes we wanted to see, we can make them now and then hopefully approve to send this to City Council if that's something that the commission wanted to do, or we could just put a hold on it, keep this as a document that we constantly are looking at, but we don't send it to City Council. So I'd love your feedback on that.
Yeah, I would say the latter. I mean, they know where to look, you know, and we can keep it as our working document. But since it is fluid and subject to change, and as Cameron said, hopefully a little general, you know, doesn't like set us up for failure, I guess is what I'm saying. You know, we don't get to certain things.
Thank you. Any other commissioners? And then we can make a decision on what we want to do with this. Any other thoughts on whether to send this or something similar to City Council, or if we just keep this as an internal fluid document? I mean, it's always going to be fluid, but just keep it internal, or is this something we want to send to City Council?
I mean, it's public, so it's not internal. It's one of our documents. If we're going to end up having a space, hopefully, where we put documents, I mean, yeah, I guess it's whatever. It's a public document now, so.
Commissioner Ken Johnson?
Yeah, so what is the benefit of sending it to City Council?
Just to keep them informed of kind of where we're at. I mean, Commissioner Gorman's right that they can watch this meeting and they'll hopefully have access to these documents, but it's more of just keeping them included, because I'm not sure many council members have had the opportunity to watch all of these meetings, especially since right now is budget season. So they have quite a few meetings going on.
Gotcha. Considering that, I would vote to not send it to them, but for our communication to them to be just a little bit more formal, and whatever we give to them, you know, should be something that's, you know, thoroughly vetted and signed off by each of us. Just my thought.
Is any other comment, Commissioner Rachel Johnson? And then Commissioner Lesnar Buxton after that.
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with Commissioner Johnson as well. Just in our working group, the community engagement one,
We lost you,
Here
Commissioner
you-
Johnson.
Can you hear me now?
It's a little
Very
faint.
faint.
We can hear
Okay,
you.
I'm gonna stop using these.
There you
I
go.
was just saying that in our working group, we had actually thought after the discussion points at tonight's meeting that we would try to align some of our pieces to this document. So, I mean, if we are going to send it along, I think we could add some more detail after tonight's meeting if we wanted to.
Okay, perfect. And Commissioner Lesnar Buxton?
I didn't say anything. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, so is John Doimus here? I don't know if we have to can we just leave this item? Sam, do you know, or Ms.
Yeah,
Ramirez?
so if you want to continue this item to your next meeting, that's fine.
Okay. So do we need a motion and
Yeah. Give that to me in the form of a motion, and then just to be on the safe side.
do we have a motion to, okay, Commissioner Alonso? Do we have a second?
Second.
I apologize. I missed who made the motion.
Commissioner Alonso, and then the second was Commissioner Wood.
Got it. We'll do a voice. That's okay.
Yep.
All in favor of continuing this item to the next meeting, say aye.
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 Against, motion passes. Thank you.
All right. So now we can get to the first of three really good topics for tonight. So the first presentation that we are going to be receiving is going to be from Lieutenant Hill. So we'll invite Lieutenant Hill to come on, and he's going to be talking about the internal investigation process and the professional standards unit. So welcome, Lieutenant Hill.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
You can.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Hill. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a lieutenant at the Santa Barbara Police Department. I work in the Office of Community Accountability. And in this position, I oversee our professional standards unit. Our professional standards unit is what often is referred to as internal affairs, or what used to be called internal affairs. So tonight, I hope to provide you a bit of an overview of the internal affairs process, as well as kind of the anatomy of an investigation, and then answer questions along the way. So please interrupt anywhere along the way, and I'm happy to respond to the best of my ability. Sam, do I understand that? Are you gonna flip the pages, or am I?
I can flip the pages for you, or I can make you an organizer.
That'd be great if we can just roll with it.
Sure.
And next slide, please. So again, our objectives tonight are just for me to provide you a short history of what I'll call POBRA, which is the Public Safety Officer Bill of Rights Act, an overview of the complaint process, kind of the route it takes within a department, as well as kind of the anatomy of an investigation, what it actually looks like, what's involved in an internal affairs investigation. Next slide, please. The POBRA, it goes by many names. It was first introduced in 1974, passed in 1977 as AB 301. It's often referred to as POBAR, lots of other kind of nicknamed acronyms, but it is the Public Safety Officer Bill of Rights Act, and it is codified in the government code. This body of law kind of began, if you will, from LAPD union representatives back in the 70s. There were some practices that were being conducted to their employees during internal affairs that were less than satisfactory to the union. They brought it up. They worked with the Peace Officer Research Association of California, otherwise known as PORAC, and we're able to have this bill introduced. Interesting of note is that the practices described were so egregious that the ACLU was a large supporter of this act when it was introduced in the 70s. Next slide, please. The legal codes where it's codified is in the California Government Code. So when you're actually looking for POBRA or this act, it is found in the Government Code, sections 3300 to 3312, generally speaking. There are some related laws in the Penal Code, but POBRA is essentially codified in the Government Code. So if you're actually looking for it on the internet or in a book, that's where you're going to find it. Next slide. Just a really quick kind of to create a nexus between POBRA and internal investigations, like what does it look like and how do they intersect? Most of the laws under POBRA and the Government Code have to do with an interview process itself. In other words, what has to take place or what is not allowed to take place during these interviews. So we're talking about an internal affairs or professional standards investigator interviewing an employee. And keep in mind, this is sworn employees as well as professional staff, so any employee of the police department. The law protects the sworn police officers. Some agencies also afford that protection to professional staff as well. So these laws have to do with the right to representation. Not surprisingly, when there's an investigation where there are allegations of misconduct, it would be a policy violation. The employee has a right to be represented. They can choose anyone to represent them. It doesn't have to be an attorney. Most of the time, I have found in my experience that it is an attorney who specializes in this type of representation. However, also police union board members are oftentimes used as representatives, and that is because they also receive special training in this area. The interviews have to be at a reasonable hour, for example. So if an officer works graveyards, we wouldn't call them in the middle of the day, which would be their sleep cycle. We would adjust to their work hours. So, trying to attend to the employees' needs in that manner. They're informed of their constitutional rights, and just like a civilian, if there are criminal allegations, then they're afforded Miranda rights, just like the civilians would be. The employees needs to be informed of the nature and the scope of their investigation prior to the interrogation. So in other words, they have to have an idea of what the interview is about. They shall not be subjected to any punitive action for exercising any of their rights. There's no more than 2 interrogators at one time. They're not to be subjected to offensive language or coercive conduct, which is probably expected in a professional environment. But that's just to give you an idea about what these laws actually say. These are specific examples of the sections of the law. So these laws would dictate how a sergeant who works for me conducts him or herself while they're doing an investigation, and outlines a lot of the procedure that has to take place. Next slide, please. So that's the general nexus between the law and the process, and I'll dig into that in a little bit deeper in a few minutes and unload that. However, right now let's just talk about how do we receive complaints. We talk about accessibility, which is very important. Our complaints are available online on our website, and they're smartphone compatible, so you can fill out a complaint or accommodation for that matter for an employee for the police department on your smartphone. They're available by hard copy in the lobby. You can make complaints over the phone. You can be anonymous when you make complaints. You could come in and meet with a supervisor, which is a watch commander or one of our watch sergeants. You can mail hard copies of complaints on what we now refer to as snail mail. And we also get complaints that are internally generated, and that kind of touches on the topic of duty to intercede and intervene. So when our officers observe what they believe is a policy violation, they're required to report that. So that would be a way that we might receive a complaint of misconduct or some sort of allegation of policy violation. So those are generally how we will receive our complaints. Next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot and a visual. This is a snapshot of our web page. You can see I have a red arrow and it's pointing to what the IT professionals would call a button on the left-hand side. And that button leads you to the complaint form. It's a combination and complaint form all in one. And that would be the most common way that they're found electronically. I'm going to slowly pause as we go, just in case there's any questions along the way. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of an investigation. So first I'll work on general process, and then I'll talk kind of about in the weeds anatomy of the investigation. So generally what happens is we receive a complaint, an incoming complaint through one of those ways, which we just talked about, and it comes to our attention. And next line, please. We receive them internally, and Sam, since you're controlling it, you can go ahead and just unload the page. Thanks. Return to PSU will be the last line. Okay, so an incoming complaint, and that's either internal or external, so it comes from an employee or it comes from a community member. That is reviewed by community accountability for the determination of where the process goes. So what that means is right now I'm the manager in community accountability, so I will review a complaint and make a determination on whether it stays within professional standards, where I have a sergeant that does full-time investigations, or whether it's assigned to another supervisor. And the way some of these decisions are made have to do with the complexity of the investigation. So I have a full-time sergeant who does nothing but internal investigations, and he at the moment has specialized training in this. So when we get more complicated and complex investigations, they will generally go to that sergeant. When we get complaints that are not necessarily as complex, oftentimes that have to do, or what I would refer to as attitudinal complaints, kind of a conduct, but not necessarily like a major use of force violation, then that might be assigned to that person's first line supervisor. So it depends on the complexity and the nature of the complaint, it will depend on where it goes. But more complex, longer investigations will remain within professional standards where we have a full-time investigator. The investigation is conducted and completed, and a side note is that the law requires that it be completed within 1 year, or to be more specific, if there's going to be any discipline, it has to be implemented within 1 year. So if an investigation takes 1.5 years, by law, we're prohibited from providing any discipline for that, even if it were found to be a violation. So obviously we have a 1 year time limit to complete these investigations. There's a few exceptions to that. For example, one would be a parallel criminal investigation, or for example, like a workers' comp fraud investigation. When we get more complex parallel investigation, the law affords us the ability to extend that time because a criminal investigation might take longer. The reason that is because the internal affairs or professional standards investigator gets access to internal investigations as well as criminal investigations. So they're all reviewed and taken into account. So the investigation is completed and it's forwarded to the employee's manager. So for example, our middle managers, our lieutenants, like for example, like myself, whoever manages that employee, that's where the investigation that's complete will go. And that manager will make a recommendation of the finding and the discipline. What I mean by that, the finding is it sustained? Was it found to be a violation of policy? And the discipline, what would be the recommended discipline related to the violation? Or was it found to not be sustained? And I'll talk about findings a little bit later. But it will be forwarded to that lieutenant or the professional staff manager, for example, in records or the business office. And then that recommendation from that manager will go to the division commander, or the captain in our agency is what we call them. And the captain is executive staff that works for the chief, and they will make the finding and determine the discipline generally based on the recommendation of the manager that works under them. So as you can see, we have several different levels of supervision and management which this complaint will go through before there's a final determination. Once that determination is made, it will be provided to the employee. The findings will be provided and discipline implemented. There are appeals that are allowed within law. It's referred to as a Skelly hearing here in California. It's based on case law. And that's an opportunity for the employee to go to the chief of police or another Skelly hearing officer, could be the city manager, and explain what they may believe to be extenuating circumstances or some other compelling reason why they found themselves in this position and the behavior occurred. And then that appeal offers the ability to reconsider the discipline. And then after that, it's decided and it's returned to professional standards for filing. We have a records management system that's confidential that holds all of this investigative material. So for example, all of the reports, all the interviews, all that stuff is all collected and held in a records management system that's confidential, and only a few people in the department have access to it. And so that's the process. That's kind of a very kind of 5,000-foot view of the process of an investigation. I'll pause for 1 second before we move into kind of an in-the-weeds discussion about the anatomy.
Sean, since you paused there, I just wanted to add, sorry I'm late. The chair and vice chair knew I had a closed session to attend. So thank you, Commissioner. I'm here as well for any questions.
All right, I will keep moving forward. Next slide, please. We'll go into the anatomy of an investigation. And Sam, I think I just highlighted each line just to kind of focus the attention on which line I'm talking about. So feel free to make them all bold. Okay, so the anatomy investigation, this is kind of the in-the-weeds conversation of what does it actually look like? So when a complaint comes in, as mentioned, it's assigned to an investigator. Generally, it'll be the professional standards sergeant, who's the first line supervisor. And they will take a look and identify potential policy violations right on the face. So in other words, are there clear allegations of a specific policy, or sometimes there's not. And again, what that investigator is looking for is identifying policy violations, and then also obviously criminal violations. So they'll look on the face value to see if there's any clear allegations of policy or criminal violations, to identify them. And if there are allegations of criminal violations, then there is a parallel investigation initiated that's handled outside of the PSU office. Most often that investigator or the sergeant will contact the complaining party. Generally, there's follow-up questions to be asked, and also to provide kind of a contact, like, my name is Sean, and I will be conducting this investigation on the complaint. And this is my email and my phone number if you have any questions along the way. So that generally happens pretty close to when we receive it. And then we start to identify, the investigator will start to identify and collect any evidence. So for example, let's use a traffic stop, which is commonly discussed when we're talking about complaints against police officers. We have what we call MAV, mobile audio video recordings in our cars. And there is policy that dictates that they be activated when we're conducting any sort of enforcement. And so we would expect that there would be an audio and video of this contact. So if it was for example, an attitudinal complaint against an officer for a traffic stop, one of the first things the sergeant would do would look for evidence such as the recording and be able to review that. They would also potentially look for any private video surveillance sources, for example, from a business nearby, or any other private recording that may have caught a different angle of the incident. and then a review of any reports. Generally speaking, any contacts we have, or specifically that end in some sort of enforcement, are going to have documentation. They're going to have police reports, citations, arrest reports. All that information will be reviewed as part of the complaint. So, we receive this investigation, make contact with the party, and we start collecting the evidence to try to compare what that says to what the complainant experienced. During that process, the investigator will identify potential witnesses. So, for example, along with the complaining party, which will be interviewed, there may have been people working at a business on the sidewalk. Maybe there was a waiter or waitress serving at a table on the sidewalk or a parklet that was right near this traffic stop. So those people may be interviewed to get additional information. Keep in mind that everyone that's interviewed in a professional standards investigation, the interview is recorded so that we can save the documentation, and so that we can always refer back to it if we need to. And then after that is done, after those steps are taken, eventually it'll lead to an interview of the subject officer or employee. So after the evidence is reviewed, video, if there's video, witness interviews, all that information will be put together to kind of tell a story, and then we'll contact the officer. They'll decide or reach out to a representative. We'll schedule an appointment, and we'll conduct a subject officer interview. Sometimes it's just the professional standard sergeant, maybe most of the time, I think that's fair, conducting the interview. Sometimes on complex or sensitive investigations, we'll have a second person in the room, another manager or another supervisor who may have had experience in professional standards as well, sit in the room. And sometimes it's an HR employee will come and join us for the investigation, especially if it touches on more broad city policy, like workplace policy. Then the sergeant or investigator will write a report and discuss all the things that we just talked about, and send the completed investigation to that manager that we discussed, and that'll be the manager that oversees the employee. Next slide. I'll pause for 1 second before we go to the next slide. We have one more slide about the anatomy.
Sean?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
Commissioner.
Just throughout this process, depending the officer, there may also be a representative of his or an attorney throughout when you're talking about the people in the room. And I can't remember, but isn't there something in the Peace Officer Bill of Rights where they're compelled to talk? It's not like, oh, I take my Fifth Amendment rights, I won't talk. So they actually have to talk.
Yes, yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. So as an employee, as an employer, we have a right to know the behavior and the conduct of our employee. So they are compelled to talk. So the role of the attorney or the representative in this interview that we're talking about with the officer is not like that in court. There's not objections and go back and forth and a judge and making decisions. The employee is compelled to answer all the questions, and if they don't, there is a threat of insubordination, or in other words, they would or could be considered insubordinate. So yes, they do have to ask the questions. The role of the attorney, and Mr. Doimus can speak to this perhaps later, but generally the role of the attorney is to clarify questions. So if the attorney or the representative thought that the question just wasn't very clear and concise, which happens sometimes, part of their role is to clarify exactly what they're asking, and also to kind of make timestamp markers along the way in case there's anything they want to bring up later in appeals or something like that.
Thanks.
I also had a question. The video recording, is this something that the public would be able to see or refer to after the investigation? Yes, that's it.
That's a good question. Thank you, Commissioner. Generally speaking, the The investigations themselves are considered confidential, with some exceptions that I'll actually go into detail about a little bit later. And they have to do with a more recent law in Penal Code 832 that that makes some of these records public. So I guess the answer is some of them are confidential as prescribed by law. However, the recent law that was introduced in 1421, codified in 832.7, and we'll go over those later, but they have to do with dishonesty and significant uses of force and stuff like that. So some are public and some are not. And that's all prescribed by law. I can keep going unless somebody else has something.
Commissioner
I think
Johnson.
Ms. Johnson had a question. Yeah.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thanks for all this info. Is there, throughout the process, is there any consideration given to whether or not this individual has had similar complaints lodged against them? Is any past behavior brought in?
Absolutely, for sure. And most often where that comes into play is consideration for the discipline. You know, there is a practice that's common in human resources referred to as progressive discipline. So, you know, if there's a kind of a maybe a smaller violation, perhaps there's some education involved, and as if the behavior is repeated, it becomes more of a significant problem, and then the discipline would be commensurate with that. So yes, absolutely, that is taken into consideration, especially recent. There are time frames where these records are kept and eventually potentially not kept any longer. So for example, in California, a citizen or a community complaint is kept for a minimum of 5 years, and an internal complaint is kept for a minimum of 2 years. So for example, if a similar behavior was, we received a complaint of an officer for similar behavior 2 years ago, we would still have that record. It would be relevant, and it would be reviewed by the investigator and the management that reviewed the case.
Lieutenant Hill, I have a follow-up on that. For the discrepancy between whether it's a community complaint or an internal complaint, why is one 2 years and one 5 years?
Well, I don't know. Perhaps Mr. Doimus might have an answer. It's prescribed by law, and I don't know the origin of the discrepancy. So perhaps it has to do with a community trust. But Mr. Doimus, do you have any history on that?
You know, looking at the legislative history, Chair Escobedo, I haven't seen any outside besides what's stated in the penal code for record retention. And again, that's the minimum we have to keep it, the 2 and the 5 years. It doesn't mean that a department can't keep a record longer, but I don't know why one is 2 versus specifically 5, you know, and that's a legislative decision more than a legal one, and through that, but that's something you would look up. Usually in the legislative history of bills, you're able to look and see what was the purpose behind that, but I've never come across it.
And so for the city of Santa Barbara, we carry that minimum threshold, 2 for internal, 5 for community.
Correct.
But we could change it if city council wanted to. Or would that be a policy decision by the chief of police?
Chair Escobedo, that would be a policy decision.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I will keep moving along if that's okay. Second slide, we're still on the kind of anatomy of the investigation. So we went from the completed investigation is reviewed. Let's see, where are we at here? Okay, so it's forwarded to the manager of the employee. That's the lieutenant or the professional staff manager. That's the completed investigation. The manager reviews and makes recommendations for the finding and the discipline, if applicable. So in other words, there may be a recommendation that there wasn't a violation, but if there was, there would be the finding as well as the discipline. And then that recommendation is forwarded to the captain, the executive staff member that works under the chief of police. And then the captain will actually make the formal finding and determine the discipline for the case. That captain will notify the subject employee of what that finding and discipline is. And then the employee has a prescribed amount of time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Jones, I think it's 30 days to request a Skelly hearing, a short amount of time to request a Skelly hearing in front of the chief of police, or, and that's in our department, or another hearing officer. Once that's done, the discipline or training is implemented. So there may be a appeals hearing or a Skelly hearing where the discipline, the finding of the discipline is unchanged, or there is a circumstance where there is a Skelly hearing and the hearing officer determines to change the discipline. In other words, it would be potentially a reduction of discipline if there were extenuating circumstances or something like that. Once that's done, the whole case is returned to PSU for filing, and then the complainant is notified of the result. So we kind of walked through A to Z of what this investigation might look like and all the steps within. Obviously, there's a lot of work. Smaller complaints that are not as complex might be resolved in a couple of weeks. Really complicated investigations with multiple employees and witnesses sometimes take upwards of a year. It kind of depends. But that's kind of the anatomy. So I'll pause again and see where we're at. I'll talk a little after this. I'll talk a little bit about findings and other things. But any more questions regarding the investigative process itself?
Commissioner O'Gorman.
Just one, and I guess because I'm thinking of the big picture, you know, ultimately what we've got to do, recommend a process or system. But how much of this, part of this is rhetorical, but is required? In other words, how much flexibility is there? And I'm not asking you to tell us all of it now, but I think that's one of the things, at least for myself, I would be looking at is, you know, what opportunities are there to maybe do things a little different or engage the community in the process more, that sort of thing.
Yeah, those are good questions, Commissioner O'Gorman. Most of what I just discussed in the anatomy slides are procedural processes. And so that is what our department has developed as a procedure. And quite honestly, with the other agencies I've been exposed to, they're pretty consistent, but they are procedural. Versus when I talked about POBRA, that's legal.
That's
so.
required.
The second point of that, as far as the public engagement, is you know, that would be more relative to what's prescribed by law because of the confidentiality of the files. And I imagine Mr. Dormis will talk about that either now or later. But there are some pretty specific confidentiality laws related to these files. But that's starting to change across the nation, and I imagine that'll come up maybe even tonight. But it is true that the laws themselves are starting to change. We've seen them change here in California, even in the past couple of years, which opened up the access to the public through PRA requests for certain prescribed sustained violations. And I'll talk about those in a little bit. And I think that might really get to the heart of some of the things you're thinking about, Commissioner O'Gorman. So yeah, we're in a bit of an evolution, but these are legal, these are codified laws that discuss the confidentiality.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kim Johnson.
Yeah, what types of stats or analytics do you have on the types of behavior or, you know, regular complaint types that have come through?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are starting to expand on tracking those trends, but I will say that, and it's true across the nation as well, generally speaking, many complaints are attitudinal in nature. So they have to do with the reality or perception of affording respect during a contact and how a person felt like they were treated. You know, we also receive those complaints. There are complaints that are more complaints against procedure, whereas the officer may have followed all the policy, but there was a complaint against what the procedure policy says. And I'll give you a couple of numbers, and I'll be producing these for the commission as we go along, and I'm already starting to respond to some requests from other commissioners. But for example, in 2020, we received about 45 community complaints and about 9 internal administrative complaints. That's kind of the numbers, and those are pretty consistent over the last couple of years. And I will be able to distribute more specific information regarding the dispositions and all that to the commission kind of as we work together and move along. I'm working on that stuff now.
Commissioner Alonso.
Thank you, Lieutenant Hill. Can you repeat those stats from 2020 really quick?
About 45 community complaints from the community and 9 internal.
Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up, is there any regular process where, let's say annually, you all sort of absorb the types of complaints and make changes or adjustments to policy?
Yes, and that's not only annually, but that's also case by case. For example, part of the executive staff reviewing the cases are also a training consideration. So, you know, perhaps there was a policy violation and there was some sort of discipline, but it might also be coupled with training. And in identifying these training issues, might identify trends where we might have to adjust how we train our officers. So yes, that is happening. In fact, I would suggest that's probably one of the reasons that I was put in this position to really start creating a more robust auditing system so that we can identify trends and do kind of, you know, some of that front end accountability. So that was really a large part of the conversation when the position that I'm sitting in now was created not too long ago. All right, I'll move to the next slide and we can keep talking. Let's talk about the findings really quickly. We have 4 categories of findings. One is unfounded, and that's when the investigation discloses that the allegation did not occur or it wasn't our employees, or the complaints are determined to be frivolous. And that's a legal classification. So, for example, complaints do come in that are on their face obviously frivolous. For example, things that might just be illogical, involving satellites from outer space or something like that. Those do come in. We do still consider them and have an intake process for them. But they are we are able to move those into kind of a legal category that are considered frivolous. Exonerated is when an investigation discloses that the alleged act occurred, but it was justified and lawful and or proper. So that's exonerated. That's, yes, what you're saying did happen, but it was within policy and legal. Another category, not sustained, that's when we were not able to determine one way or the other fully whether we could exonerate or not. So in other words, we're not able to either sustain it or exonerate it. From a professional standards standpoint, and if I didn't mention this before, I used to be the sergeant in professional standards. This is what we really try to avoid, right? This doesn't help anyone. So these are ones we really focus on trying not to land in a not sustained category. And then sustained, and that's the final determination that the actions of an employee were found to violate law or department policy. So these are the 4 categories. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about those as well. All right. And I'm sure everybody's thinking about it, because I certainly think about it when I look at these. I will be providing information like annually in 2020, how many fell into which category. So I will be providing disposition statistics. And in fact, it is one of my goals in my position now to start producing this information more publicly. There's no reason that we don't have to include officers' names or anything, but there's no reason that we shouldn't be providing this in an effort of transparency. So that's something we're moving towards as well. Next slide, please. So this goes back to a question that was asked a little while ago, and it has to do with what can we make available to the public? What videos, what reports? Recently, and I would suggest, at least in my opinion, across the nation, there is a movement to open up a lot of these confidentiality laws. In fact, there are some states that have minimal, and the actual whole personnel file is public. And I see somebody who has a national perspective on the call as well, who might be able to speak to that a little later. But we are, I think, in a place in the nation and policing where we are focusing on that balance between an employee's right to have confidentiality and the public's right to know who are providing them police services. So 832.7 makes it so that any discharge of a firearm at a person, any use of force resulting in great bodily injury or death, any sustained finding of a sexual assault or sustained finding of dishonesty. These are cases that are releasable through a Public Records Act request. I think that touches on a question that was asked a little bit earlier. Mr. Doimus, anything to add on that slide?
I would just say, you know, a lot of these requests or a lot of this information the public has access to is through a Public Records Act request. You know, the federal government calls it the Freedom of Information Act. That doesn't apply to us, but you know, other states have different laws. But for California, that's what it's under. And that's kind of letting the sunlight in terms of creating transparency. And so these are 4 categories of investigations the publics would have access to. Generally, you know, governments have some leeway on what else they want to disclose to the public. But when it comes to personnel records and investigations, we're precluded by law for the privacy rights of the employees under statute to not turn over other requests. So we're limited basically to these 4 categories. So there may be something outside of that, maybe discourteous behavior as one investigation, and someone would want to see the investigation to that. Since it's not in these 4 categories, we are prohibited from turning that over. So that's all.
All right, next slide, I think, is just a question slide. I suspect that this will just start to be absorbed and more questions will follow at a later date, but I am always available to you, and we can open up more discussion right now, or we can hold it for another time. Commissioner Sanders.
Mr. Sanders.
Yeah, my question is, with that previous slide, under those 4 categories, I understand that they are available to the public, but is any of this actually released in, I don't know, like a way that it seems like the requirement is on the public to request that documentation? Is there anything that is released by the department in and of itself saying that this happened and we have determined these actions or what have you? Like, is there more of an action on the department to release that rather than the public requesting it?
No, you are right. Right now, it is a Public Records Act request. So it is a request that comes in to release like specific documents about this. The only caveat to that is what I touched on earlier, where you know, it is in my purview and charge right now to start creating a lot of this data that's more like anonymous data, but would include some of the statistics related to these categories that would be put out to the public and can be put out to the public. But I don't know if Mr. Doimus, you have anything else to say on that, but you are correct. Right now, it is a Public Records Act request. And a lot of times, quite frankly, it comes from the media and then it's reported on, which has happened in our department.
I have a couple questions. So after your determination, this is Vice Chair Cepeda. So let's say after the determination, whoever filed the complaint wants to appeal that determination, how is our process for that? I can either give you all my questions all at once, or I can do one by one.
Please, one at a time. That's all I can
Okay.
handle.
Okay.
Vice Chair Cepeda, thank you for the question. Yeah, currently there is no appeal process for the finding. Something that we have put into place is that the investigator, the sergeant, offers a meeting with the complainant to talk about process, general process, and things that might happen during this investigation to come to a conclusion. But as of right now, no, there's no appeals process.
Okay, and then I was looking at the complaint form that's online, and I noticed that the PDF form is not, the link is not working. So you can only submit a complaint, or maybe it's only my device, only submit the complaint online. So if somebody wanted to print it out and go turn it in person, it's not working. And then another question, is it possible to have like maybe different languages later on, not just Spanish and English, for language accessibility? Is that something that maybe we can work on, or maybe this is something this commission could do, or a different department? Just because if somebody wants to file a complaint and let's say Chinese is their first language, and having that, or maybe requesting an interpreter or something, yeah.
Yeah, a couple points there. One is that I will check on the IT portion of this. That's out of my wheelhouse, but I can certainly make the request to ensure that the PDF's downloadable as well. And the language accessibility is a huge conversation right now. I think you're very consistent with what's been discussed in the city IT department. I know that our website generally does have an option for different languages, but it probably wouldn't reach that PDF, so that probably wouldn't work. However, I know we are in the process, the city in general is in the process of acquiring a new platform that has that addresses a lot of those accessibility issues. So I think yes, two ways. One is certainly we can work on that in general, but it would be kind of a citywide effort for accessibility, which I know is being discussed because I was just a part of a steering committee where we discussed it. So I think that is something that is being worked on and addressed right now, and I think it's a very valid point.
And then this complaint form, just to reiterate, is for all law enforcement. So if somebody has a complaint against like a probation officer or sheriff's, this would encompass all of those complaints, right?
No, it wouldn't actually. It's only for our employees. That's the only ones that we have purview over for conduct. So if a complaint came in from, well, for example, we recently had one that came in where an employee worked for another agency. We do two things. One is we call the complainant and let them know that that employee doesn't actually work for the city of Santa Barbara. And then we forward that complaint to the professional standards unit of whatever that agency is, just to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks.
Okay, great, thank you.
Commissioner Alonso.
Commissioner Alonso.
Thank you, Lieutenant Hill. To what extent would an independent oversight body be subject to the stipulations outlined in POBRA?
You mean, for confidentiality?
For all of it, like I'm wondering, like, is POBRA like the jurisdiction of POBRA, or like the stipulations in that act? Does it refer only to internal investigations conducted by the police department for their own employees, or does it apply to, would it apply to like a future independent oversight committee?
Yes. So I'll tell you what my answer is, and then we'll have Mr. Doimus make sure I'm right. I believe that that is a protection of the employee, period. So if it's an official employment investigation, those protections would apply, because the oversight body would essentially be an agent of the city. But let Mr. Doimus, who's actually the legal expert, speak.
Sure, thank you, Lieutenant Hill. Commissioner Alonso, that would apply in anybody. So it's not just regarding police departments investigating their employees. If you hire an outside investigator, if it's an administrative body looking at it, a panel, no matter what, all the rules of POBRA, which are contained in the government code, must be adhered to. They cannot be waived. And if they are violated, you run into two problems. One is that kind of a fruits of the poisonous tree, the evidence pertained may not be used in a proceeding. And second of all, you can, if it's considered malicious or willful violations of POBRA, then let's say the city's committing that in this case, let's say, for argument's sake, then they're open up to fines for up to $25,000 for each violation. So these are state law mandates that cannot be waived and must be adhered to, and it is for the protection of the employees, the officers.
Thank you both. And I think you answered some of my second question as well here, Mr. Doimus. So just as a follow-up, so some of these models that we're looking at for civilian oversight propose altering or replacing core functions of the internal affairs unit, or in this case, the PSU that we have at the Santa Barbara Police Department. So what are the main portions or functions of the existing PSU that we can't touch? So in other words, are there parts of the existing machinery that we can't alter because that would make the Santa Barbara Police Department non-compliant with POBRA, like you've just outlined for us?
Commissioner Chair Escobedo, Commissioner Alonso, it depends on what type of civilian oversight you're looking at. I think one of the things, and hearing some of the questions in Sean's presentation is, why are these rules or why is this process here? And a lot of it is for efficiency and to follow the law and to be precise. So for example, noticing is so important because if you don't follow the proper noticing procedures, you're committing a POBRA violation in terms of apprising someone of the nature of the circumstance being investigated or the timing of it, delivering it. If you're having more than 2 investigators in a room. Another example is, I saw in Sean's presentation talking about the 1-year statute of limitation in terms of when someone discovers a violation who has the ability to act upon it, the discipline must be imposed within that 1 year. There are some exceptions to it. For example, if an employee is not available due to sickness, workers' comp fraud, but generally, because of these mechanisms in there, you want to have the most efficient way about it. But how you go about it or what's recommended is, taking a look at what the process is, what the commission's doing right now, seeing how the police departments do it, and then also looking to see, do we need to duplicate that by having another investigatory body, or is resources better spent looking at an auditing type, right? Looking forward to, future policing in the 21st century, policies, looking at our policies, and do we want to expand upon that? But regardless of what body it is, let's say you have an investigatory body, they still have to follow POBRA. So if it's a commission that has it and the commission has hired an investigator, full-time investigator to do it, they have better create policies and procedures just like the police department and adhere to the same things, because it's a civilian under auspices of a civilian review doesn't mean they get to skip those procedures at all. They have to follow them. Otherwise, we run into serious legal trouble.
Understood. And this is just one more follow-up along this theme for Cami, if they're still with us, from NACOL. I'm curious, I assume most states have some kind of police officer Bill of Rights legislation on the books. So would you say it's pretty common for all of the different models of civilian oversight to be kind of operating in the way that Mr. Doimus just described?
Yes, there are, and if they don't have an officer Bill of Rights, operating under state laws that dictate what information can be released. So there really isn't an oversight entity that doesn't have to follow the same rules that, for instance, particularly if they're doing independent investigations or just handling confidential information, they have to follow the same rules that the police department would if they were doing the investigation or audit internally.
Thank
And
you
you've
all.
got examples up and down California as well that as we move on, we can kind of look at how they're handling it in that specific model.
Thank you. So one last question. Sorry, I've got a lot. But Lieutenant Hill, so we've recently seen the Santa Barbara Police Department conduct an independent investigation for a non-sworn officer. I'm not asking you to comment on that specific case, but I noticed that you didn't really include a lot of information in the anatomy breakdown of when an independent investigation is initiated and what the process there and why, like what circumstances would warrant an independent investigation. So how common are independent investigations of SBPD employees, and are those relevant to this discussion, being that you omitted it?
Yeah, well, a couple things, and maybe Mr. Dominguez can also comment. But if an independent investigation was going to be conducted, to speak frankly, it would happen above my pay grade. It would be the department heads and the city attorney's office, and for reasons that they might or might not be able to discuss, it would be decided. So it's not common for us to have an outside investigative body for what I would call normal complaints. If I think what you were speaking to was a civilian manager, and so for reasons that I'm not privy to, that decision was made. The other relevant part of that, and I think it is relevant, your question, is that in the state there are laws unfolding right now that have to do with bringing state investigators in for certain cases for use of force, et cetera, for perhaps like officer-involved shooting. So there is a bit of an evolution of that for significant use of force cases that's on point with your comment about bringing in outside investigators, whether it be from another government agency or whether it be a private organization. So specifically what I'm talking about is the State Department of Justice playing a role in some use of force cases across the state under certain circumstances. So I think that's kind of unfolding and changing, but historically I haven't been privy to the conversations where that's decided.
So you'd say like the vast majority of cases are handled internally?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Hill, and sorry for taking up so much space, everyone. I just had a lot of questions.
I did see some other hands. Commissioner Reno, did you have something?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Sean, for the report. Very informational. Seems like you and Sergeant Drayton do a great job. I don't think that, doesn't seem like 40 something complaints is a lot of complaints, or 9. It seems like you guys have a good job. My question would be just your opinion on an overview with, and maybe Cammie knows this as well, can respond. With this lengthy and detailed of a process, why all the hoopla all over the country and other police departments with problems we've had this past year? I mean, it just, if every police department, and I don't know if every police department has similar, but it sounds like they do, had similar, why all of the problems that we have seen this past year? And my second question had to do with 832.7. Is there a fifth category having to deal with race, disabilities, gender? That was just the 4 categories. I think you said was firearm, discharge of firearm, force, sustained sexual assault, and bodily or dishonesty. I think were the 4 categories. I just wondered if there's a fifth one having to do with race or gender or disabilities.
Let me ask the answer the latter question first. That's very specifically prescribed by law, and I just actually pulled that from the penal code. That's what was passed through legislation. So there aren't any other specifically under, it was under 1421 that have to do with that. There are a lot of other things happening right now that are legislated that have to do with the other demographics, like RIPA, if you haven't heard of that. That does have to do with racial disparities and tracking law enforcement data regarding stops and whatnot. So that is literally unfolding now. We have employees being trained on it, and we will be implementing it pretty quickly, actually, and we'll be reporting that type of information to the state. So while 1421 didn't specifically discuss what you bring up, there are other things that do address some of those issues. And that will be public information under RIPA, which is maybe another conversation. Your first question, which is a really important and broad question, and I don't know that I would claim to be a person who can speak to the national problems that we're having, but I'll make a couple of comments if you'll afford me that space. And that is, first and foremost, one thing I'm keenly aware of is that all departments are different, extremely different, extraordinarily different, especially from state to state. And departments have different cultures, organizational cultures and professional subcultures. So I know that there are drastic different behaviors in different departments. However, we our police officers, myself, we're all humans. We're a microcosm of society, and all the imperfections that humans have. We will, regardless of what we try to do and put things in place, sometimes we will see them, which is why we have a couple of components that are very important. We want to hire the right people with the right heart, and we want to have accountability processes in place to back that up. So I wish I had the short answer to why we're having problems like this, but I think that's why I'm here, and that's why all the commissioners have committed your own time to this issue to really help make progress on it. So I wish I could say more to that. That's all I have right now.
Thanks.
Cami? You're muted.
Thanks. So if I could add, what Lieutenant Hill said about that all police departments operate differently and have different cultures is so true. There are some that we can hold up as examples of how a police department should function, and then there are others where we can the exact opposite. And I think even for those police departments that you can look at the Internal Affairs Division and say that this is working really well, that there's some transparency to the process. We're also dealing with a situation where in most communities you have many people within the community who have a distrust of the police. And by whether it's founded or unfounded, there is a process within civilian oversight when it is transparent and accountable and holds police to a level of accountability that helps build that trust back, because there's a very important part of that is the community engagement. And when I say community, I mean broader community. It's engagement not only with those who the police serve, but also the police, because in the end, they are part of the community as well. And so I think that's why that we see it, because even when you hear a set of procedures like we just did that seem great, and you have 45 complaints a year, and that doesn't seem like a lot, that there still are some trust building issues that need to be worked on. And so I think as you're forming your civilian oversight entity and the process that it will take on, the functions that it'll take on, I think looking at that building trust piece is going to be imperative.
Okay, this is Vice Chair Cepeda. I had another question. How does the complaint process change if it's a minor who is submitting a complaint? Or is it the same process?
It is the same process. However, we would likely include a parent in the conversation, depending on if there was some sort of sensitivity otherwise. But yeah, generally speaking, a parent, at least historically, a parent is part of the conversation. So it might be an incident that involved a juvenile, but the parent would likely bring it to the attention of the police, and then we would work with the family.
Okay, and then also, I know that the number like 45, 47, whatever it was of complaints seems like a small amount, but let's also like remember that a lot of people may not be placing complaints in. So there may be a lot of folks who don't feel safe, like how it was just mentioned, you know, because of like citizenship status, because of whatever reasons, you know. And then also, I thank you, Mr. Hill, for this presentation. I really like how also NACOL has 13 principles of effective oversight. Maybe as we move forward, like we can start also looking into that and how we can implement some of these things, and maybe have another, like a follow-up debrief discussion about like certain things, because even just by looking at this presentation, I already see like things that we could potentially change or maybe create into action within the formation commission, you know, that we hopefully are able to implement. And then also, you know, when you have somebody, a loved one, who's, you know, been killed at the hands of the police, it may just be one person, but to that family, it makes a huge impact, you know. So I'm sorry, but I don't want to minimize those complaints as well, because it probably took them as well a lot of courage for them to even submit that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And Vice Chair Cepeda, I wouldn't produce those numbers to claim that they're the only incidents where people felt harmed by police or felt like they were mistreated. Certainly not. It's just a number that's a measure. And certainly we talk about community trust and accessibility. There are others out there, like you said. And so I wouldn't try to minimize and hold that one number to be the total measure of interactions that weren't satisfactory.
I have a question. So you showed us the entire investigation process. A question I have is, how often is it that there are members involved in the process that work day to day with the person who's being investigated?
Members involved in the process, like a complainant?
So let's say you receive a complaint and there's going to be staff that's working on it. So obviously, I believe it's the PSU staff, right? And of that staff and others, because I think you even mentioned captains are involved in the determination of what the punishments are. But of all of the staff that are involved from when you receive the complaint to when a decision is made, of that, how often is it that there are members involved that work day to day with the individual? And the reason I ask is to give you a little bit of context is for other jobs, it's typically a third party that you're not working day to day with, like an HR department or sometimes even someone outside of the company.
Sure. It's not very often that happens. It would only be on those kind of minor, what I would call like minor complaints that a first line supervisor might be investigating. that can be kind of more educational in nature. However, it's one of the reasons that our PSU works under community accountability, and I'm assigned directly to the chief of police. So we are an independent group in the department that falls directly under the chief of police, so that we don't have normal day-to-day interactions on patrol or in the investigative division with those employees. So it's pretty rare, and it's only on kind of the lesser serious cases that might happen. And if there are, another thing to address in that conversation is, if there are complaints of specific harms, like workplace type harms, there's immediate action to resolve that, and that may be separation of employees to create safe spaces. So, but generally speaking, it's not the case. I think that's why PSU is often assigned as an independent group under the chief of police, and not into kind of the day-to-day interactions with the employees.
Thank you for that. And then I had another question about the Skelly hearing. So if there's a recommendation for discipline, the officer asked for a Skelly hearing, there's a change in from what the recommendation was. Is there rationale that's documented, or is it just that there was a change based on extenuating circumstances?
There is some documentation usually with a Skelly hearing. I think it's department, it depends on the department, and perhaps even the policy of the chief of police. But generally speaking, there will be some sort of documentation of what the employee represented. I don't know if Mr. Doimus, if you want to speak any further to that point.
Sure, Chair Escobedo, view it as a minor brief or legal decision. There will be documentation explaining the finding or the reasoning, whether they decide to uphold the discipline, or whether, for example, they reduce it, and explain why. What were mitigating factors presented at the hearing that would cause that? Any Skelly hearing of the final decision issued by the hearing officer would contain rationale as to what the decision was.
And so if we had an oversight body that would go and audit the decisions made, they would be able to see that that information and the justification for changing the discipline.
Chair Escobedo, yes. The interesting thing is, so a Skelly hearing is a right established by law. It's named after a case, and part of it goes on to the property right that public employees have in continued employment, the expectation of continued employment in their job. And so part of that due process is the Skelly hearing, where they're allowed to they can have a representative in there, but it's not like your normal hearing where they're allowed to cross-examine witnesses or bring witnesses to testify. Generally, it's the employee going in there and explaining their side of the story, or what's been going on in their life, or any mitigating factors, whatever it may be, whatever argument they want to raise. While a commission can look at the Skelly factor, usually you want usually the review for an independent is at the initial discipline level, right? What is the basis for, in this case, a captain issuing the level of discipline? The Skelly is an independent right the employee has as part of the due process, right? So you want to look at department level in terms of what the initial discipline was. You can look at the Skelly hearing, but every employee, at least in the police department, except very few, like the police chief, would have that right to have that hearing. And then following up by, which I'll probably get into more detail in my presentation, the civil service hearing. Of course, an oversight could look at all those factors and see in terms of overall review of the department in order to help a recommendation. But you would normally see those in the Skelly document. You would see the initial notice from a captain that explains the level of discipline and why that level of discipline is being recommended. And the Skelly would then decide if they sustain it or change it and why that reason is. And that's important too for later on tiers of fact. The Civil Service Commission could look at these, and they do look at these documents to see what was going on procedurally in the case, what decisions were made, why, and if a court eventually gets to it, they would see those same documents as well.
And just last question is, for that 1 year deadline, it's from when they find out, not when the act was committed, correct?
Correct. It's when a person who has a position of authority, at least to act upon it in some way, found out, right? So if the act was committed 2 years ago, but it was hidden for some reason, and then let's say a sergeant found out about something that happened on a patrol incident, that's when the clock starts.
Okay, and then it's 1 year to give discipline if you're going to give discipline?
1 year to issue the initial discipline notice. So not having the Skelly hearing or the civil service,
Okay.
it's 1 year from that. Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Mr. Wood?
Hi, I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but how would the, when it comes to handing down discipline, how would the union then be involved in this? And would they have power over these types of decisions?
No, the union doesn't have influence over decisions of discipline. The union may have a role in representation, so maybe representing the employee through the process, but no direct role and influence over decisions of discipline.
Okay, thank you.
And if I can, I want to go back to Commissioner Reynaud's question. You just posed such a phenomenal question that I've almost been thinking about it the entire time we've been talking. Why is this stuff happening? And I just want to touch on a couple of things that, at least for me personally, are really important. Sometimes people get hired that probably shouldn't be police officers. There's over 800,000 police officers in the United States, and sometimes agencies miss the mark on who they hire, which is why it's so important to invest exhaustive resources in proper hiring, in background investigations, in training. And the second is accountability. There has to be accountability within departments. As I think we probably have all seen in some of these really egregious circumstances, there have been red flags along the way. And we have to have processes that hold our employees accountable along the way. And then third is culture. An agency has to empower their employees to feel like they can intervene and feel like they can change a bad outcome. And I just wanted to touch on those, what I believe are critically important components of how to avoid some of the things that we've seen, as you put it. So, and those, we can't skip those. Those are critical, especially the culture, creating a culture in an organization where people feel empowered to ensure that people are safe.
Thanks, Sean. And does that culture come from the leadership, or how does it come from the academy? Where is it coming from?
Culture, in large part, comes from the leadership, but honestly, there's components of all parts of those processes that create culture. First and foremost, who we hire, right? Those people that we hire should aspire to be a part of what our culture is. I'll give you a very personal example. I was hired over 20 years ago and from another state. And the moment that I realized that I wanted to work for this agency was when they went to the state I was from and interviewed my boss from when I was in high school. And that told me that they care about who they're hiring and that they're going to pick the people who fit, have that, they have the knowledge of that person's background. So things like that are important. So all of it creates culture, but absolutely the leadership has to set the expectations for the culture. Okay, well, that's all I have. And of course, I'm always available if anything comes up.
Thank you, Lieutenant Hill. Really appreciate it. So we have a couple more topics. How's everyone feeling? Do we want to take a break or do we want to go into Mr. Doimus's presentation on the city charter? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Good. Okay. So, Mr. Doimus, if you can give us our presentation for the next item, which is city charter considerations related to civilian oversight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Escobedo. Good evening, members of the commission. Lieutenant Hill is definitely a tough act to follow, so I'll try my best. Next slide, please. So in California, you have two types of cities in terms of its governance or where it derives its authorities. You have charter cities, which you can see is the vast minority, 1 to 3. We have 121 versus 361 general law cities. And charter cities, through their charter, are given special powers to govern what are municipal affairs, and I'll get into that in a second. Santa Barbara, of course, is a charter city. General law cities are formed under the general laws of the state with local voter approval. Next slide, please. So what is a charter? It's basically a constitution. We have one that has several sections, and it acts like the constitution for the city. It can only be adopted, amended, or any section repealed by city vote. Obviously the primary advantage of a charter allows greater local control for a city in terms of its governance. So, for example, we have provisions, and I'll get into in terms of how we elect our mayor, or our zoning or land use laws that are very important to us, where general law cities go to the de facto laws of the state. There are certain areas where the word is preemption, where even if we are a charter city, we cannot legislate. For example, we cannot have a municipal code section that deals with homicides. That's under the penal code. We have to follow that. A lot of sections in the California Vehicle Code dealing with serious driving issues, that's preempted from the state. Even certain issues like alcohol in public can be preempted by the state. And what preemption is the state says, this is a major statewide concern that applies to all of us, all cities, counties, unincorporated, anywhere. And so we occupy the field in this regard. And so we will create the rules, laws, legislation that applies to this. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the California Constitution gives the authority for a city to become a charter city. And it's both in Article 6, Section 3A and 5A, which gives, and the most important part to look at that slide is the home rule provision that gives charter cities supremacy over what we call municipal affairs. And the next slide will go into that. So next slide, please. What it is, there's no definition. There's no definition what a municipal affair is in the California Constitution. It's looked at a case-by-case basis. Some areas you can see, like for example, land use zoning decisions, whether you want to have short-term vacation rentals or not. That's something a local city can decide. How it spends its local tax money, how it does in municipal election matters. I'll get into the most recent section of the charter that was amended, had to do with district elections versus general elections. Next slide, please. These are other examples of municipal affairs. How do you remove officials? How long is the terms? What is their payment? The date of elections, etc. Next slide. So Santa Barbara, as I said, has a charter city. It was adopted and came into effect on that date of May 2nd, 1967. As I mentioned, the last update in our charter, it was probably the last update for a good 10, 15-year period, regarding district elections. What that means is generally we had general elections for the city for appointing our council members, meaning that whoever had the most votes would get appointed to their seats. Now we have district elections, so each council member is running for their own district, and whoever gets the most votes between that district gets a seat. And in looking at Article 5, so our charter deals with the powers of the mayor and council. Article 6 deals with the powers of the city administrator, what they're able to do, what their authority is, and what their responsibility. Article 7 talks about other city officers, and that includes the city attorney. Next slide, please. Article 8 now deals with city boards and commissions. And you see in the parentheses there, I have what's called charter commissions. What that means is simply that those commissions already created under the city charter. And I'll be talking in more detail about the Fire and Police Commission and the Civil Service Commission. Those are charter commissions. There are specific sections in the city charter that talks about their powers and duties. Another one is the Planning Commission, the Airport Commission. So there's various ones. This commission here is not a charter commission, obviously. There was no vote. It was an appointment through an ordinance by the city council. And how did this become? It's section 800 there, where the city council may create additional advisory boards or commission as they deem appropriate and needed. And that we can create the terms, the manner of appointment, etc. So that's how this wonderful commission came to be under section 800 of the city charter. Next slide, please. I figured I'd point out to your attention section 801. The city council also can use appropriate funds for each commission or board as they deem appropriate in order to carry out and perform its duties. As you know, council did that, and that's one of the reasons why we have NACOL too, in terms of funding to allow you to make a well-researched recommendation as to your issue. Section 805 is oaths that you all did on your when you first took your position here, and again, that's based on the city charter. So I just wanted to point that out as well. Next slide, please. First commission out of the two that I want to talk about is the Fire and Police Commission. That's in section 816 of the city charter. And originally, the Fire and Police Commission in the city, when I'm talking about the 1920s and 30s, had great power. They had the ability to hire or fire the chief of police. They could set salaries. They were akin to a lot of those powerful commissions you see in LA or San Francisco. But since the creation of the charter, their powers are not as strong, but they still have a very important role. I listed right from the charter some of their powers. Essentially what they do is they act as an advisory capacity to the city council, as well as to the fire and police chief in terms of procedures and how to run the department. And they also go over the fire and police chief over in terms of budget. Next slide. As you see too, there's a section D talks about recommending the city administrator and city council the appointment of a fire and police chief. Generally, how that's performed is the Fire and Police Commission will select 1 or 2 members to sit in an interview panel and then give their input of all the candidates to the city administrator. Then the city administrator goes in closed session to get approval of the appointment of the candidate, fire or police chief. Now, there are additional powers outside of the charter that the Fire and Police Commission have, and that's found under our municipal code. And a brief kind of illustration of how city government works in Santa Barbara, the #1 law at the top of a pyramid is the city charter. That's the supreme law of the city in terms of locally. Right underneath it is our municipal code that has 30 different titles, very long document. And then underneath that are resolutions. All of them have authority, but the supreme authority is the city charter. The municipal code we'll talk about, a lot of it will have rules and regulations, and violations of those municipal codes can be even considered infractions or even misdemeanors of law. So an example of a municipal code violation is carrying a dagger in public, drinking in public. Maybe it's a building code violation, work without a permit at a house. So that's where you find a lot of those violations under our municipal code. And for the Fire and Police Commission, when it comes to the municipal code, here's where they act as a kind of a review body. Or administrative judicial body. They do either hear appeals or review things such as the denial of a pedicab or even taxi cab permit, appeals of a denial of a permit for a sauna or massage parlor. You see their dance permits. Dance permits are kind of an archaic term where nightclubs allowing actually dancing, but it deals more with that. Nightclubs are supposed to present a plan to the police department that shows how they're going to properly operate and not create nuisances like noise factors, etc. around there. So it's not just dealing with dancing in the middle of the club. Next slide, please. The Fire and Police Commission.
Alonso?
Oh yes, please. Go ahead.
Commissioner Alonso?
Oh, are these just examples, Mr. Doimus, or is this like a comprehensive list of municipal code?
These are just Commissioner Alonso. These are just examples. There's probably another 6 or 7 that are out there, but I just picked some of the ones I've dealt with or that I could quickly provide in a slide. But yeah, these are found in the municipal code. Another one is in terms of tow operators. They perform 2 functions. They permit tow operators in the city, and also the police department has what's called a tow rotation list, meaning if there's like accidents or DUI accidents or anything where the police department has to call out, there's a rotation. I think right now currently 7 tow operators, and they all take their turns. So if I'm first in line and I go out for a call, I go back in line. So everyone at equal amount of calls. They review and approve those who are on the police department's tow rotation list. They also review the uniforms and cars and everything else of private security. That's private patrol operators. And the purpose of doing that is making sure the uniforms, the vehicles, or the equipment, not the equipment, but the uniforms and vehicles that security are using are not similar to the police department or the county sheriffs to cause confusion among the public. And finally, another important power that both the Fire and Police Commission and the Civil Service Commission have is the ability to issue subpoenas if there's a hearing before them. And disobedience of the subpoenas, just like anything else, it potentially is a misdemeanor. So if they want to call a witness or obtain documents on an appeal hearing, they're able to do so. Next slide, please. Now the civil service system so it's not the commission that I'm talking about, it's the actual system is established in section 1000 of the city charter. And what it is it creates how we select, employ, and classify, demote, suspend, and handle grievances for our employees who are in the classified service. So we have, as you see in section 1001, 2 categories of employees, unclassified and classified. And the city charter is very specific in who fits in the unclassified service. It creates a list of about 5 or 6. So for example, city attorneys are unclassified, meaning we don't have, we can be at-will employees. We can be let go with cause or no cause at all. And the city charter also includes there that unless for future positions, because this was created in 1967, any future positions, if the council creates, and they have any categories of it, it's deemed unclassified unless the city council says it's classified. So for our purposes, I would say the vast majority, for sure, I really can't give a percentage, but vast majority of city employees are classified, meaning there needs to be cause. They have due process rights, which is a Skelly hearing and a civil service hearing, which I'll get into in a second. Next slide, please. So the Civil Service Commission review. City Charter Section 1007 reads in part, it's a very long section, that any person who's in a classified service who is suspended, demoted, or dismissed can ask for a hearing before the Board of Civil Service Commission to review that. That always occurs after the Skelly hearing. Person has 10 days to ask for, after a written decision of the Skelly is given, to ask for a review of this of the Board of Civil Service Commissioners. And that's kind of like a trial, which I'll get into in a second. Next slide, please. Before I get into the powers of the Civil Service Commission, I do want to add that Section 1007 of the Charter also is very important because it also lists causes of action that an employee can be dismissed. So this is separate from what you would see the Santa Barbara Police Department manual or an employee handbook. They list about 7 or 8 categories which a public employee can be dismissed. One of them, as Lieutenant Hill was talking about during his presentation, he mentioned the word insubordination. That's one of the terms or reasons an employee can be dismissed under the city charter under 1007. And in reference to insubordination was the question is, if a employee refused to cooperate or answer any questions in an administrative investigation, the refusal can be considered insubordination, and the person can be fired for that action. So as Lieutenant Hill correctly said, in that situation, an employer has the right to find out what's going on in his workplace. He has a right, they have the right to ask questions and find out if there's any improper behavior or any violations of laws, rules, regulations. If the employee refuses, it's an act of subordination. So a lot of times you'll see lawyers when they're representing, for example, an officer in this case, and let's say it's a criminal thing, they may advise, you have two choices. You either potentially incriminate yourself if you answer this question, or essentially maybe you resign because the refusal is de facto insubordination. So getting back on topic with the slide I have before, Section 808 of the Charter provides what the Civil Service Commission can do. So it acts in an advisory capacity in terms of personnel administration of how we run it. They also, of course, they can make an investigation upon request or its own motion on conditions of employment in general. So not specific issues, but general conditions of employment and report its findings to the City Council. Next slide, please. And of course, the important one there is D, hear appeals of any classified employees who are either suspended, demoted, or removed. They can't hear, for example, one lower level of discipline that employees could receive as a written reprimand, where an employee it's put in the personnel file and it dictates what they did wrong or what policy violation. The Civil Service Commission doesn't have the authority to overturn that. So what would happen in a case of a written reprimand is a person would have the ability to have a Skelly hearing, or at least a police officer does. Then the Skelly officer can uphold the written reprimand or strike it. But what's important of the written reprimand to have there is part of that progressive discipline process that Lieutenant Hill was talking about, saying, okay, maybe it's not worthy, the issue of the policy violations, it's severe, but not worthy of a suspension or certainly not a termination. But now this is the second time you've done it. You've done it within maybe a 2-month period. Now maybe it's worthy of a suspension. Now a third time, we keep increasing the level of discipline. Next slide, please. What's interesting is any decision made by the Civil Service Commission does not get heard by City Council. So many of our boards, including one of our most powerful planning commissions, a lot of those decisions or hearings they hear get to go to the City Council. There's probably 2 or 3 that I could think of for the city where the appeals of any decision do not go there. One is the Building and Fire Code Board of Appeals if they're overturning a building official's determination. And the reason for that is usually the members of that board are technical experts. And so for that, you would go to court. For this, there's no City Council. What would happen is I put that section up there, 130.010. Let's say the Civil Service Commission upholds the termination of an employee. What the employee is required to do is then file an appeal within 90 days of the written decision, when they get the written decision. If they fail to do so, that's the end of it. They can't bring a lawsuit later on. And that's the case I have listed below. There's a couple cases that talk about this. One of it is Miller versus the City of Los Angeles. And I've dealt with a situation too, where I have a civil service hearing, and let's say it's a termination, and the commission upholds it. The commission gives their written ruling, gives notice, and also says within there you have 90 days, provides this municipal code section, and says you have 90 days to appeal the decision. If they don't, that's the end of it. And in one case I had, the person didn't appeal in 90 days. Around 300 days, 300 days later, they filed a lawsuit under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And I had that case thrown out right away because I said, look, you had your chance to appeal it by having a court look at the commission's decision. You didn't do that, and you're done. And what this case stands for is this. Civil service hearings are faster than anything in court, any litigation you do. They're cheaper, they're quicker, because a person can have a hearing within a month. It's less costly. And so if you're going to take advantage of that, that is what you're buying to. That case has an excellent wording. It says, these aren't dress rehearsals for the real thing. Meaning if you choose to do this, then you're bound by it, and you're not going to have the city or everyone else waste their resources. This is the track or the path you chose. If you don't follow up on it and exhaust your remedies, administrative remedies, then you're precluded from bringing any other lawsuit involving your employment with the city. If someone does file an appeal, what is the city's obligation? We get notice of an appeal for a court to review it. The city has the obligation to lodge what's called the administrative record. That means the transcript and all the supporting documents that was heard in the hearing. The court gives great deference to the commission, meaning they usually don't like to overturn a decision unless there was a procedural error or there was no basis to come to the decision. What's interesting is there have been some overturned decisions from a civil service commission filed by a public agency. One of them happened down in San Diego, dealing with the police department. What happened in the case was at the civil service hearing, the county of San Diego proved the officer was lying, and they recommended termination because dishonesty is such an important aspect of being, having honesty is such an important aspect of being a police officer. Because if you're dishonest and lose your credibility, how could someone trust you in writing a police report, or how could the public have faith in you? So in that case, the commission determined that yes, the officer lied, the county proved its case, but for some reason they felt, they felt sorry. There were mitigating factors where they felt like, maybe it's too harsh. We're going to reduce it to a long suspension. The county viewed that as a great error, saying we did prove our case, took it to Superior Court, appealed the decision, and the court sided with the county, saying, look, you factually prevailed in this case, showing, and the commission agreed that the officer was dishonest, and went in detail why honesty is such an important aspect of being an officer and how it does crush the public trust in that, and upheld and reversed it and upheld the county's original determination of a termination. Next slide, please. So in thinking about this brief presentation, what is the relevance for this commission? Currently as structured the city charter, we can't hear employment decisions. That's completely in the purview of the Civil Service Commission. Maybe we look at in terms of how those cases get there, but in terms of who decides it and what the decisions are, that's strictly within the purview of the Civil Service Commission as the charter is constructed. Could there be a potential overlap with the Fire and Police Commission in terms of, having a body that reviews policy and makes recommendations, or maybe even beyond recommendations in terms of stronger language? That's definitely a possibility. But at least I wanted to provide a kind of a quick presentation to show, where the city's power comes from in terms of the charter, what a classified system is, and then who decides the deciding factor in terms of an employment decision here. Just I'm sure when we were anticipating one of the questions, civil service hearings aren't frequent. Maybe we average one every year, every other year. A lot of times, as any litigation, right? So, in terms of civil trials, hardly any go to trial. I think last time I looked, this is pre-COVID, obviously, 95% of trials, 97% of trials settle. A lot of times that happens. It's the same process procedure here. A lot of times we settle before going to the commission as well. At the hearings, there are rules and procedures. Every employee or witness is sworn in, given the oath. Hearsay is allowed, so there's a little more latitude. It's a little more relaxed rules in terms of evidence. But there's a court reporter, it's sworn in, and there's a presentation of evidence. And at the end, the hearing can be an open session, like a meeting when they convene, but the deliberation of a Civil Service Commission, when they actually decide the level of punishment or the case, that's done in closed session. Also, the employee has the ability to request that the hearing itself be in closed session, but the commission can or cannot decide. As far as the hearing goes, you have 5 commissioners. And what you have is a hearing officer. The hearing officer usually is a lawyer hired and paid for by the city or the union, both. They can both, the city always offers the union the ability to also share in the cost if they want to. They don't have a deciding vote in terms of the outcome. They're there kind of acting as a judge, and the commissioners kind of act as a jury. You know, the hearing officer may handle objections. They'll make a ruling on the introduction of evidence, but the overall voter outcome is decided by only by the 5 members of the commission. And the commission themselves during these hearings ask questions as well. So usually what happens is, let's say the city's presenting their case first, they'll call a witness. The city will go on and ask the witness questions. Then the lawyer representing the employee would cross-examine that witness. Then it goes back to the city to redirect examination. And when that's done, then the commissioners themselves can ask questions. So that's about it for my presentation. I know it's late, trying to be brief, but I'm open for any questions the commission may have.
I have a question, I've thought about this a lot over the years. When I was on the Fire and Police Commission a long time ago, there were some of us on it that wanted to expand to do more review, but it was clear there was not the political will for it, either from the city administrator at the time or the mayor. But because one of the things that we latched onto was this section 816B, and that is recommending to the city council rules and regulations, and then also exercise other such functions, powers, and duties not inconsistent. So I guess at this point, just speculating, if this commission were to say, well, we want to expand or strengthen or change the role of the Fire and Police Commission, using that as a sort of a skeleton, is that something that requires a change of charter, amendment to the charter? And if so, how's that done? And secondly, if we don't, but we create our own review system that some of these overlap with, how is that reconciled? So
good, very tough questions, Commissioner Gorman. The first thing is, what was missing is in the language of the charter, there's no mandating language, right? It's always the word recommendation. And so when you use the word consistent with that, what's consistent with that? The ability to recommend but not mandate to the police department or the fire department changes. How that can be reconciled, there's 2 ways, right? Through charter, but that is expensive, requires vote of the people. Or as I mentioned, Section 800 of the city charter, where maybe the council does it by ordinance and creates a section within the ordinance, specifying, things that can be mandated, or different areas the council or this commission want to look at, and doing it that way. So for example, there's nothing in the municipal code about dance permits, the charter about dance permits, or nothing about tow operators. These were all created under the municipal code, and everyone figured as part of the legislative process, the appropriate body to hear tow appeals or tow operator appeals or dance permit appeals was the Fire and Police Commission. So that's how that could be accomplished as well.
And is that set the number of commissioners, the ordinances, or like keeping it at 5?
That's a very good question. That, because the number of commissioners are dictated in the city charter, the change would have to be through the city charter. That would be something that would have to be the vote, because as I mentioned earlier, the charter prevails over the code in terms of power, right? So since the charter specifies 5, and let's say you have a municipal code that has 7, there's an inconsistency. So you look to the law, which one prevails over, which document prevails, right? And it would be the charter. So that would be something different.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Commissioner Alonso.
I'm sorry, is that me? Okay, thank you. So Cami, I had a question for you. After reviewing some of this charter language with us, my first question is, how common is it for commissions like ours to propose revisions to charter language to accommodate whatever model we ultimately adopt and recommend? And my second question, so how common is it? And my second question is based on what you've seen here of the charter language, would that be something, you know, that we would want to consider, or would this, or would we want to, you know, like what are the other options? Like, is this like we would go through municipal code or ordinance?
So most commonly, it's established through ordinance. There are quite a few entities out there that are are brought into existence through a charter change. I will say more often than not, that happens when there is not a political will to do it otherwise. Because it is, I mean, it's a campaign. It's a major effort to get that passed. And if you have the political will to put something down and get an ordinance passed, then that tends to be the avenue that people take. Now, I will say there are some oversight agencies in the country that have started out as an ordinance and then eventually move into a phase where they ask and get voter approval for a charter change, because the political winds kind of shift. And, you know, if you're in the charter, I mean, as was stated, it's, you know, it's the supreme law. And you tend to have kind of this more protected space for oversight in a charter. However, it is really rough to get that passed. And if you, I would suggest the other way is probably better at this point if you do have the political will in the city to make it happen.
Thank you. Mr. Doimus, or maybe Mr. Ramirez, if you're still on the call, how many revisions to the charter has the existing council made? Maybe, or like in recent history, like when was the last revision made to the the city charter?
Commissioner Alonso, 2018, and before that, probably another. So one revision in the last 12 to 15 years. And so I think Cami raises a really good point in terms of a lot of this change is done through the municipal code in terms of where you put it. You know, just like this commission, right? It wasn't created through charter vote. It was created through Section 800 by the city council, creating, appointing it, you know, how many members, the term, the objective, and that's the easier way and the more immediate way. Like you said, it's an election, right? You know, it's something that has to have money and get on the ballot. It's a long, very long process. What I don't want, my only advice to this commission is I don't want it to get bogged down in terms of worrying about city charter or municipal code. The most important thing is, you know, what is your recommendation? What is what policies or what's the effective model you want to go there? And then that's up for, you know, our office along with council, everything else. What's the best avenue or best way to achieve that? If the council wants to take up that recommendation or recommendations, whatever it may be. You know, it's an arduous process, the charter, like I said, versus, you know, changing the municipal code. But, you know, a lot of that focus, you know, is more about, you know, what is the recommendation versus, you know, instead of, you know, how to go it, because as Cami said, and as I think you're getting the point, charter changes are very difficult. But that's not to discourage the commission, because the commission should be just focusing on what is the recommendation, because there are even avenues. As Cami said, it's usually done through ordinances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose I agree with you in terms of like getting bogged down, but I'm just like trying to get ahead of like, what if the recommendation is at odds with the city charter and requires those revisions? And so I want all of us to kind of be thinking about as we progress here. So I think my biggest takeaway from what you said is like figure out what model we want to recommend first, and then let's have that conversation. Do I have that right, Mr. Doimus?
You do.
Thank you.
I guess then, just to clarify, in the absence of changing the charter, regardless of what we do, these powers of the Fire and Police Commission and the Civil Service Commission exist, right? So
Correct. And they exist. And And so the purpose of why I said in the last slide, one thing that's not going to be created is a different body or a way to hear disciplinary appeals, right? That's the purview of the Civil Service Commission and remains so. And that's generally the way it's done. You have a different model. You may have a review committee or investigatory body, and they bring the case, but who decides the case is always a different commission.
Okay.
I have a question. So it sounded like at one time the Fire and Police Commission was pretty strong, and something changed between then and now. And I'm guessing, and I'm wondering what was that, because that should be something that we are aware of
I
for
would
creating
say
this commission.
one thing was the change of police chief along the way. And so that culture and people getting on it who saw their role as protecting him, you know.
But were there policy changes that led to the diminishment of power of the Fire and Police Commission? That's what I'm wondering.
Maybe a concern that there would be. You know, one of the chief who was chief when I was on it, for the most part, was Chief Brisa. He was very supportive of the commission, tried to bring us into things, and this was in the 90s, like, you know, hiring panels and things like that. And then he died suddenly of a brain tumor. And so it took a while to get another police chief. And then, you know, the culture kind of changed a bit, I'll say. So it's really the political will that needs to be there.
And
we're in another, you know, moment right now where there's going to be a chief. It's so important.
Right, and I guess I'm more referring to the power to hire and fire chiefs and the ability to set budgets, and that's a pretty powerful commission. What changed between then and now to where it's more recommendation rather than being the decider?
Yeah, Chair Escobedo, as you talk about it, NACO's done a lot of research there. You initially started seeing review type body commissions in the 20s and 30s, and they were pretty powerful. And Santa Barbara followed suit. That started to wane, and there wasn't, you know, a really interest in strong, you know, review type bodies until the civil rights era of the 1960s. But so you had a powerful commission in the 20s and 30s, and it started to wane. And then in 1967, the city charter is created, and it creates these powers, and it creates powers that are, you know, advisory or recommendation, and they're not really anything in there in terms of, like I said, mandating anything. So it's part of, it follows the natural curve of the historic norm. Santa Barbara does it. You know, some commissions, the larger cities have retained those powers, but you know, so that's kind of really what changed when you have these commissions. The idea of it from the 20s, and you really don't hear anything about review commissions or anything else for a 40, 50-year period of time. That's a natural byproduct of it.
Thank you. Lieutenant Hill?
Yeah, sorry, I sort of echo that. I think John touched on it a little bit, but along with individuals that change, you are talking about a really broad era shift in policing. So that era of the 30s, like the 20s, 30s, you know, even into the late 30s, is that political era. The 30s really started the professional era of policing. So we were in the political era, which makes sense of why you had more political players making these decisions. And then there was a need, at least a desire, to want to separate policing from politics. And that's when we moved into the professional era in the 30s. And then you start to see these changes, and then we move into the civil rights era. So There is a really broad national pattern that you will see this following as well. But yes, in the 30s, there wasn't a decision made. An officer wouldn't even get a retirement badge without by the way, it was the Police and Fire Commission back then, without them approving it. So it does follow the error shifts in policing in our nation.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No, but Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to ask any members of the public that have any public comments or questions, if I can open it up to them.
Thank you, Mr. Ramesh.
Sure. I don't think there were any, but I just want to confirm that. If anyone in the public would like to ask a question or speak on any of the last two presentations, use the hand raised feature of the app. I sent them both a private message and neither responded, so there are no comments on either of these presentations, Mr. Chair and Commission.
Thank you, and apologies for missing that. Going forward, we'll definitely be better about that. Any other questions for Mr. Doimus, Lieutenant Hill? All right, then I think we can close this item. And I don't know about you, but I could stretch my legs. So let's take a 10-minute break and we'll be back at 8 o'clock. Sound good? Cool. We are in recess until 8 o'clock.
Hey, Rich, we're taking the chair called for a 10-minute break. So,
Awesome. Thank you. I figured as much. Are we coming back at 8?
yeah, I'll come back at 8. So, stretch your legs if you need to, drink some
Yeah,
water.
that'd be great. I've been sitting down for way too long. Thanks, Sam.
All right, take care, buddy.
Hi, Commissioner Sander.
Hi, Commissioner Killebrew. Good to see you.
Good to see
I
you
thought
too,
you guys
Commissioner
said to
Wood.
keep it on a first name basis.
Well, normally I would say, hey, what's up, Rich? What's up, Gabe? Hi, Louisa.
What's up?
But I
Maybe
know
we'll change it to first names for next meeting.
we should change the culture to just say first names instead of so
I
formal.
like that.
That works for me.
I'm
Yeah,
good with
can we
that.
please do that?
Can we just call each other by, is that what you're saying? Call each other by each
Yeah,
other's
like
first
let's
names?
just call each
Yeah.
other by first
I'm
names
like,
instead of
I'm
full
Louisa,
Commissioner
please.
O'Gorman or Commissioner Sander. Like,
Because it
it's
makes
just
me really nervous.
it's
Fair
a
enough.
little too formal, and hopefully we can break down some some barriers by
I don't
removing
even
the
know how to,
commissioner part.
I don't
I
even
mean,
know
we
how to
can
change.
start today.
Let's do it right now.
Hey, Christian, how you doing?
How do you do
Good to see
that?
you. We're talking about removing the commissioner part and just addressing each other by first
First
names.
names.
Unless you like the formality. I don't know.
So Chair, before we get started again, I have Christian's PowerPoint ready to go when they give their group updates.
Sounds good.
We didn't do a PowerPoint. Oh, well.
Not required. It was just something that Christian and his group wanted to do. So I believe you have all your commissioners back. I would just ask that they turn on their camera if they'd like to, but I believe we're ready to begin if needed.
Perfect. So we'll call the meeting back to order at 8:01. And I think we have a consensus that moving forward, we'll, unless otherwise requested, we'll use first names. I think it works better for conversation. And really good point, Jordan. I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think I just received a text message from Anna saying that she had to leave the meeting a little early. Something came up, so she won't be with us for the rest of the meeting, but we'll definitely send her the recording so that she gets all the information.
Got it.
So we are going to move to our last item for the day, and it's the item number 7, Commission Working Group updates. Each Commission Working Group that we formed last meeting will give a progress report and any information, and if they were requesting specific feedback, they were in the progress reports that we had received prior to this meeting and are on the community formation website. So do we have a group that would like to go first?
Louisa's shaking her head.
Christian's group, which is the, you can remind me, it's the model, the oversight models working group update. So that's the PowerPoint. Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for everyone's hard work in all of your groups. Our working group is the model research group, and so we're taking it upon ourselves to be the CFC experts on these different model types that are available, what models other cities are using, especially in California, and also how to incorporate the best practices and successes of other city efforts into our own recommendations to the city council. So we started with simplifying the dense information on the available models into a model summary presentation. On our first meeting, we found that none of us could even remember like what all of the 4 models were. And I imagine it's similar for the rest of you. It's very dense information. It's kind of a little black and white readout in the board packet that we received. And so we wanted something that was more accessible so that we could use it for community outreach or just kind of breaking down this information a little more simply. So basically, we're seeking feedback on this presentation to improve it. I'll run through it really quick, and then we'll ask for your feedback. Additionally, our group has also begun the work of studying successful proposals from other commissions to their city councils to dissect the parts of a successful proposal. So Cami was nice enough to provide us with some example proposals that were adopted by city councils. I believe Berkeley, Athens, Georgia, and Madison, Wisconsin were the 3 ones that we're reviewing. So we're going to dissect that and basically come up with what we're calling the hamburger summary because we wanted to map out for everyone what the components of a successful proposal look like. So stay tuned for that on future meetings. But for now, we'll focus on this quick review of the model types and get your feedback. So just as a reminder to everyone, there are 4 civilian review system types that are currently being used by oversight bodies in the United States. They are review, investigation, auditor, monitor, and hybrid. If we could go to the next slide. Review is the most common type and basically enables community input on the quality of completed internal affairs investigations for misconduct complaints, like we just discussed, the existing process. But it's also important to remember that these don't have to be limited to just completed internal investigations. So you can also empower review boards with additional authority to refer misconduct complaints for further internal affairs investigation or send back inadequate investigations or other recommendations that sit alongside existing administrative functions. So we go to the next slide. It was really great to get this presentation from Lieutenant Hill before this, and then also the work that the policy training and hiring working group is doing on our existing policies, because we have to have a really good understanding of what, if anything, the resulting oversight body will change about our existing administrative functions. So the review model tends to be the lightest on these changes because it typically sits on top of our existing functions, reviews internal affairs investigations, and makes recommendations to police executives on potential follow-up actions. So we go to the next slide. The review model is currently being used throughout California, and especially in a city like Santa Cruz, which is similar in size to Santa Barbara. We go to the next slide. So next up, we have the second most common type of oversight, which is investigation focused. Basically, this model requires the services of trained staff to independently investigate misconduct allegations, sometimes replacing critical functions of existing internal affairs. So the staff in this model typically have more authority to subpoena information like body or dashboard camera footage and other documentation or witnesses. Oftentimes, these are accompanied by some kind of board or commission that advises the staff and helps with decision making. We go to the next slide. So in terms of administrative changes, this model requires some heavier lifting because you do have to replace or duplicate existing processes with an independent function. So you can also have to provide some kind of guidance on the authority of the staff and or accompanying board to recommend or make decisions on subpoenas, imposing discipline, or other investigation related authority. So we go to the next slide. Here are some examples of where this is being used in California right now. Berkeley, California is one that is similar in size to Santa Barbara. If we could go to the next slide. So moving on to the auditor monitor model, here we have a really interesting one that really focuses trained staff on doing the work of dissecting the data on department misconduct investigations to identify patterns and make proactive recommendations on systemic policy and behavior changes. So these systems tend to have a pretty wide authority to audit various aspects of police department pattern and practice. We go to the next slide. I apologize because this is a typo, but it should say that the auditor monitor model requires moderate changes to admin functions. Ultimately, they do sit on top of existing internal affairs machinery like the review model, but tend to have broader authority and can even actively participate in open investigations or advise or enforce best practices. So depending on the scope of the authority you want to give an auditor monitor, this model can have broad implications for changing how the department currently conducts investigations. We go to the next slide. Here are some cities in California that are using this model, and today with Inglewood being a jurisdiction that is similar in size and scope to Santa Barbara. If we could go to the next slide. And so then, of course, we have the hybrid approach. This is the one that's gaining in popularity for how oversight is done in the United States, and it is perceived as the best choice to get a custom fit for your community. So as the name implies, it involves a combination of oversight functions borrowed from other models. The most important thing I would say that we all want to remember about, or what we want to consider if we want to go with a hybrid model, would be to decide if we want it to take the form of either a hybrid agency or a hybrid system. So a hybrid agency is basically one oversight body that performs multiple functions, whereas a hybrid system is multiple agencies working together to perform different oversight functions of the same police department. So a hybrid system could look, for example, like an independent investigative agency and an inspector general. If we could go to the next slide. So in terms of how this could impact administrative functions, well, that just really ultimately depends on what you decide to go with in terms of the varying functions. But it can obviously range from moderate to heavy changes to accommodate multiple models of police oversight that potentially replace or supplement some of the existing internal affairs functions. And of course, it will depend on which of the two approaches we do want to pursue. So either this hybrid agency or the hybrid system. And we go to the next slide. And again, here are some examples of cities in California that are utilizing hybrid approaches today. And to the next slide. Oh no, my little things didn't come through. We had to fix that. Okay, so there's something to improve. They're puzzle pieces, by the way, but basically the cost and complexity of these vary, these different models. And so here on this last slide is just is the same summarized information from a previous board packet, where we have a review focus tending to be the least expensive and least complex to administer, and investigation being one of the investigation and hybrid being some of the more costly and complex to administer, with auditor monitor kind of being midway through between there, if that's a good way to describe that. But yeah, so basically those are the models. We want this deck to be available to you, the slides, so that you can refer to it, and also perhaps use it in your community outreach about these different models with folks. And I have a script here as well if you want the script on how to describe these. So would love to get some feedback on this from the group, and especially from Cami, because I definitely don't want to have misspoken about any of these models.
Well, maybe we can start with Cami then.
That was a great presentation. And if it would be helpful, since it's something that you'd be using in community outreach efforts, there are also some slides I have that relate to the strengths and weaknesses of each of those models that I'm happy to share with you to slide those right, no pun intended, slide those right in. The only thing that I would say is that a lot of times when we're talking about the cost of associated with different types of models, that you know, when you see that investigative focused piece, you know, it has traditionally, that's one of its weaknesses, is it's very expensive to have highly trained investigators full-time doing the work. So there are, I think it's important to mention that one of the reasons the hybrid has become so popular is because you have cities where maybe it's an auditor who is doing the work specific to auditing and monitoring the law enforcement agency. But then if there is a situation in which they feel that something needs to be independently investigated, then they have that authority to bring in a contracted investigator. So you're not having to hire someone full-time to do that job, because you might not need them full-time, but you at least have access to that. So there are some nuances in there that I think I can provide some additional information on each of those, particularly that hybrid model and how some of these work together to help provide a community what they need, but also help solve some of the issues that someone might have with like a strict investigation focused model. So I'm happy to provide all of that, but otherwise this is a great presentation.
Thank you. That's really helpful feedback to have. And I think that that's something that, like, so we have like the broad explanation of hybrid, but we don't have like, what are all of the examples of the different ones and how they work together? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, and I'm, if there is a need, I'm happy to meet with the subcommittee to walk through some of those, or I can do it with the full commission to walk through what some of those different examples of hybrid look like.
Okay.
Mary?
Kristen, this was really good, and a good PowerPoint too. So going to be a hard one to follow. But I think ultimately, I mean, these are the questions. This is going to come down, is what we're all going to, you know, kind of ultimately have to come down to. So the more information for me, and whether, again, if there is going to be a receptacle of documents that we can reference, or a reference library, it would be great to have even as many examples, you know, that you've seen, you know, or Cami that you've seen. I know that would be helpful for me. The other thing I was wondering, because you have the dollar signs are great, but I'm wondering, Kristen, not to ask you guys to do more research, but looking at kind of more of an estimate, especially the ones that are comparable in size to us, like, are they spending $2 million? Are they more, maybe percentage of their budget, you know, of their overall budget? Because I think, you know, that is when we do our recommendation going to be, you know, obviously a significant part of it. So, so that would be helpful to me. But anyways, I appreciated it a lot.
Thank you. I think that's great feedback. And Cami, do we have just like aggregate data on like average costs and that kind of stuff that are in a database somewhere?
Yeah, so I'll send you, so we're actually getting ready to roll out something called the Civilian Oversight Agency Database. And so it's part of a larger project and some reports that we're hopefully going to be able to publish soon as well, that kind of that partner with the data. And it is not a complete data set for all 200, but it does have varying size agencies. It includes budgets, size of law enforcement agencies, size of city, and the authorities that go with them. And so it can at least give you a place to start. And then one of the things that we've done with other cities is then once you have those cities that are similar size, that you are interested in their model, then we can help. If we don't have that information in the COAD database, then we can help start to pull that information from those cities.
Thank you. Yeah, and I kind of just pulled from the information on your website initially just to get an idea of like similar cities to us. So I was just like Googling like population and like putting it into a spreadsheet. And so I'm happy to do that for because I think we want to expand the scope just beyond California as well, just to search for best practices outside of the state, wherever they may be. But I think starting with a solid foundation of who's doing it in California under the same types of state jurisdiction and requirements is the best place to start, and then to broaden it from there.
Yeah, and I would also say that don't rule out something just because a city that is much larger than you is doing something. Don't think you can't do it because it wouldn't translate. Most oversight systems are scalable in nature, so you can look at something that the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City is doing and be like, well, they have 35,000 officers that they're overseeing. That's not us. But they do have some best practices or effective practices that they've employed that might be really useful in certain circumstances. So don't rule out everything over a certain size, because you might be able to use some pieces of that as well.
Thank you. I think that's great advice. And any additional feedback on the presentation or how to improve it or make it more clear?
Yeah, I thought it looked great, and I think that with those changes and the extra information from Cami, it's only going to be that much better. And for all these documents, I was going to wait until the end of the meeting, but Sam was actually able to establish a Dropbox of sorts for us to store our documents and be able to exchange information and documents with each other. Sam, if you wanted to describe it just a little bit more.
Yeah, so just tomorrow I'll be emailing you a link. It's a folder for the commission to be able to drop documents in there, review them. We'll also place some of them on, or all of them on the commission's website, but just for ease of purposes, you can drop them in this folder. So you'll get an invite from me. You'll have to have a Microsoft login, whether it be Outlook or MSN or any other Microsoft email features, but they'll allow you to kind of share documents with each other as a group or with the commission overall as well, rather than emailing to me or things getting lost kind of in the pipeline.
On that note, if these documents are also being placed on the external website, should we only reserve the Dropbox for final documents as opposed to working docs?
Yeah, I'll kind of let you determine, and Chair can take the lead on that, answering that, but I'll kind of let you kind of defer on, what documents you'd like to share with each other.
Kim, were you talking about for the working group, if you have a working document and?
So for instance, if Christian wanted to immediately put this up because people want to reference it, but there are plans to add or adjust some of the information, should he wait until the document is like buttoned up and then put it on the Dropbox, knowing that it's also going to go on the external website?
That's a good question. I'd love to get everyone's feedback on that.
Yeah, and what I could offer is allowing you to share documents with each other, and then once it is ready for public consumption, and it is ready for posting, one of you giving me a note that this document is available, and maybe we'll tag it, final.
Okay.
And that'll be the cue for me to, post once I get a message from one of you.
Can I suggest something maybe? Because I think that's a really good point. Yeah. Maybe for documents that fall under that category, putting something either on the first page or the last that this is a work in progress or draft, something like that. So someone doesn't pull it up and think, oh, this is what they're doing. I mean, I think it's clear, but yeah.
Good point.
Cami, one quick question. I characterize changes to a city administrative function as light, moderate, and heavy. Is that appropriate way to, or do you feel that we like hit the mark on or that our understanding was correct on the different models and how we describe them, or maybe we could remove that qualifying language so that it's not misrepresenting anything?
So let me think about that, because I've never described them in that way. And I don't want to give you an answer without thinking about it a little bit further.
I'll send you the doc, and then if you you want to drop comments in there or respond on the email thread.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And now that we have the contract, we are able to host Cami or other NACOL representatives at our working group meetings as well.
Great. Any other feedback? Because I'm happy to turn it over to the next group if someone's ready to go next.
I think we're good. Thanks, Christian. Really appreciate it. Your work group did awesome. In fact, I was really impressed with all of the work groups. I really appreciate everyone's work that they put in.
I'll go next.
All right, Mary, you're up. And I think you're the policy, hiring, and training group, correct?
Yeah. So yes. So we've, although we've using PTH, although it's actually PHT, so kind of interchange that, but policy, training, and hiring. And these are the group members. We met a total of 4 times, at least 1 hour at a time, if not more. You know, initially it was really great to just kind of get to know each other better, why we, you know, applied for the commission, just some background stuff that's hard to do with 15 people. And so, you know, I appreciate that. And then since all of those subjects, you know, basically we need to study. So what we did right off the bat was brainstormed a list of documents that we'd like to obtain. And that's, we put a little cut and paste on the last page, basically broke them up into requests about policy, you know, things such as the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, professional standards, complaint training. We wanted to see the, you know, what training is there, racial and ethnic disparities, use of force, some data requests that are pretty similar to all of you, and what, you know, what Sean talked about that he's working on, which is the data that I think we all want. And then hiring and promotion, and that's one area that we probably need to focus on now a little bit more. You know, looking at how interview panels are set up. What about people that are transferred in from other agencies? Because again, as we mentioned earlier, and what we focused a lot on is, we can have wonderful policies, but what is the culture of the agency? And so, and then, you know, what was the culture where the person came from? So that was, you know, putting that list together, and then made the request to Lieutenant Hill. And then he joined us for the second meeting, and it was a really, really good conversation. He was probably on with us for almost an hour and a half, and then explained some of the documents that were provided, kind of helping us shape requests for other ones. And then we also had got a link to the Peace Officer Standards and Training. This came after the second meeting, in between second and third. And I put a link there, and I would just suggest, no matter what committee you're on, when you have time, maybe take a look at that. POST is what's required of all peace officers in California. There's the initial basic course, and that's what this link is to. And so it's broken down into outlines for all the different courses. So I highlighted some of them that we focused on: principled policing, handling crowd control, use of force, domestic violence, cultural diversity. And so, essentially then, we talked about that some of those policies had a lot of great things in them, or some of the course descriptions, some of the policies that Sean shared with us. And as Lewis brought up earlier and kind of permeates a lot of this, is that some of the policies seem ideal, and then the question or challenge remains, if the policies and expectations, are they enforced or monitored in practice currently? What are the consequences if members of the department do not follow those policies in his or her training? So some of those are the more challenging questions. And then, of course, trying to keep in mind, the umbrella being, we're looking at ultimately recommending something. So is that something that, that body, one of the things they could do? Because in addition to whatever kind of investigative model we end up with, what we talked about was that, our hope would be that whatever it looks like, it's important for any system to not only focus on the complaints themselves, but also on things like community education and engagement. Do people know about the complaint process? So things other than, the investigation obviously is important, looking at complaints and all that, but then also community education and outreach. And another form of community input regarding police complaint review that was brought up by a couple of us, could that include some role that community members could play? And I think somebody asked that earlier, and given all those other parameters, that might be challenging, but that's something to look at. So in other words, I guess you could compare it to like a shopper where somebody drives through Jack in the Box and to see how they're doing. That's probably a bad example, but follow up with, especially on big incidents, like what were people's experience? Because for the most part, and it's probably true about everything, it's a small percentage of people that actually complain or file a complaint, and that doesn't mean that that there aren't concerns. The other thing, many of us on the committee have either worked in the field of corrections, crisis resolution, policing, human rights advocacy, and so we've all in our own ways faced the challenge of experiencing on a daily basis crisis situations, threats, tragedies, and the toll that takes. So we believe that any police review system should include a review and oversight of what kind of PTSD, stress, after action resources and follow-up are there, with the goal of processing issues and emotions that can result from experiences on the job. In the absence of that kind of intervention, those experiences can contribute to inappropriate interaction in the community. Lieutenant Hill brought up a program here in Santa Barbara called At Ease. It was founded by a former sergeant, McGrew, and so we requested more information on that, and he might be someone when we do community outreach or something to hear from. Also, we talked about the importance of the committee members being able to engage in current police training opportunities and specifically take part in ride-alongs. Some of us have done that already, others haven't, and so we mentioned that to Lieutenant Hill, and I'm not sure what the process would be, but we thought it was a good idea, because I think, our feeling is, especially in reading all these policies and kind of the ideal outcomes, the more that we as a body really have a grasp of what is going on a day-to-day, step, it's imperative to ensure that we recommend something that's most pertinent. And then an ongoing evaluation of community-based programs and practices and engagement of the community is imperative to ensure law enforcement is following through to nearly perfect fidelity. So we have requested, as I mentioned along the way, some more information regarding stats and specifics on discipline, evaluation metrics. We're going to analyze strengths and weaknesses, and with support from NACOL, we want to explore the oversight models, although we realize there's another committee. I think at some point we're all kind of going to merge. But now we have the information that you've provided, Christian, and that Cami will also be adding to. And then we've got a few other things about policies within the Santa Barbara PD, current role of the field training officer, how many hours of training are dedicated to proactive training in relationship-focused policing, community outreach versus the paramilitary style training, and that takes up the bulk of the post academies. And then in response to Lieutenant Hill's input regarding a number of newly created or expanded community-oriented programs include a newly developed juvenile diversion program, creating and implementation of 2 positions for police officers dedicated to community relations. We requested more information on the following: the roles of the new police community liaison officers, information on the use of restorative justice practices, and any statistics available yet on the juvenile diversion program. Okay, so that's it. Sorry, it's not in a PowerPoint, but and then my fellow committee members have agreed to graciously help respond to any questions or input. So.
The other piece that I wanted to share is one thing that we talked about is evaluating police officers. We asked Lieutenant Hill about how they evaluate their police officers and how they're promoted. And that is information, I'm not sure if we put that in there, but that is information that we're requesting. And, it used to be, it was only based on, the number of tickets or the number of arrests that have been made, and that shows that they've been doing a great job. But apparently that's now shifting to include more of the more community engagement type things and, meeting their community members and getting to know them and that type of thing, and how that can engaging in listening sessions when there is a serious crime that has happened with families that were involved with that, who were impacted by that crime, that type of thing. So that's information that's also coming and will be synthesized for us to provide to you all.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. Anything else? Is there anything that anyone sees that we're missing in terms of looking for or at policies?
Great presentation and great work, everybody. As far as the list that we're looking at on the bottom, on the last page, are these like forthcoming for the rest of the committee to look at? So these are requests that have been made, and we're waiting on the department to provide this.
Yeah, some of them we've gotten, some of these we have, some of these we don't. Is that what you're talking about, or?
Yeah, I would love to take a look at some of these materials.
Oh, yeah, and now that we have a receptacle for them, we'll put as many as possible. I did include the link to the post. So when you go there to the link, it takes you right to links to all of those trainings. And since they're all, oh, thank you. Wow, thank you. So since they're all required of anybody that becomes a police officer, it's helpful. So just click on any one of those. Okay, property crimes.
It gives you a basic overview and the what they do. It's not the actual curriculum itself and how much time is allocated for that specific piece. That's more information that we would like to know and are going to be searching for.
And some of them are longer than others, that give a lot of detail. But you basically, what it tells you is what the expectation, kind of the minimum expectation is of the peace officer. And then every year they have to do a certain number of hours refresher. So
I was just going to ask, on that note, did you see evidence of training for dealing with different types of communities, specifically like the LGBTQ community, trans community, etc.?
Yes, there's separate sections on well, it's cultural diversity, then people with disabilities. There were a few, these are only a couple of good examples, but they are all.
Kim, when you take a look at how the 600, it's almost 581 hours of posts, when you take a look at how it's divided, it says the topic, the category, the subject matter, and then how many hours in the academy. In Santa Barbara's case, they do their academy in Ventura, and it says how many hours they spend on most. So one of the first things we looked at was how many hours was spent on physical training, how many hours were spent on the range, how many hours are spent on the law, and everything else. And most of the hours are, you know, as we looked at them, were not spent on those things that you asked about, but those things were on there.
That's good. And that's a good distinction. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Lieutenant Hill had told our group, and I believe most academies are trained, and Mary mentioned this, in a paramilitary fashion, which basically means you use military time, you learn how to write your reports in a military fashion. I don't know what term he used. If Lieutenant Hill's on here, it was something about pressure learning. There was a lot of pressure in the academy, I think he referred to it as. Is Lieutenant Hill?
You know, where they like yell at them and they kind of put them in
like military training.
It's a stress academy.
He also said that he thinks a lot of academies are trying to get out of that aspect of it, because as you can imagine, you're training for the military, it's kind of a them versus us type of attitude, and that can be kind of dangerous. You get on the street and come in contact with citizens. It can be kind of tricky.
Well, and also when you look at kind of into some of the curriculum there, like about dealing with, you know, people with mental health issues and that, it is so contradictory to that kind of atmosphere. So, you know, I mean, you think about, well, okay, they're getting this training on how to be sensitive, and then they're being yelled at and you know, doing use of force. So it's quite a wide array, I would say.
And then the other type of training police officers, if they obviously graduate from the academy, is their FTO, their field training officer, the training that they get once they get on the street with an FTO. And we haven't really explored that yet, but that's the next step. If you graduate from the academy, you're on probation, you get with at least 2 or 3 different field training officers, and you know, they kind of shadow you and train you on the street, so to speak.
And just to kind of add to the conversation, the mention of the sort of the military style training, I think creates a culture where that's sort of the frame of mind. And going back to what was said earlier about the culture needing to shift, I think there's definitely something there that we can address.
I agree. That's, definitely.
Good point.
Lieutenant Hill?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, all the discussions that are had are extremely valid, but I didn't want to misrepresent the training that's happening in the academy. It is a stress academy. However, there is extensive amount of time spent on communication skills, de-escalation. All that is being covered in the academy. I didn't want to misrepresent that that's not addressed, but they do find ways to induce stress to see how the cadet or officer is going to respond under stress. You know, because that is still a necessity to be able to control, you know, themselves in stressful situations. So I didn't want to misrepresent. I think the academies and the one we use specifically Ventura, they've come quite a long way in the evolution of how and when they induce in stress, and it's very strategic. And then there is a classroom kind of adult learning module environment as well. So I didn't want to misrepresent that.
Lieutenant Hill, 2 questions. So is it ever possible for somebody to observe part of an academy class or something like that? And secondly, if people did want to do a ride along, what's the process in your department?
Sure. As far as the first question, observing the academy, I'm not really sure. I'll find out and report back. It is the Ventura Academy. We don't own the academy, so it's not our policies and rules. But I would imagine that there's some, if nothing else, there's like videos, representations of the classes that are happening that we can probably get our hands on. But I'll see if there's site visits allowed. And secondarily, for ride-alongs, that's just a pretty simple application. I just will say, because of COVID, we have suspended ride-alongs right now, just for safety reasons. And as soon as they kind of open back up, I'll definitely inform the commission, and I can supply and help facilitate the application process to make ride-alongs happen.
Thank you. That's all we got.
So there's one thing that I didn't see on the list that I would like to see is a couple years back, and I tried looking for the article and I can't remember, but there was an article in the News Hawk about a police officer who was the highest paid employee in the city because of overtime, and the amount of overtime that they were doing was an obscene amount. So I would like to know the overtime policy, if you all could look into that, because that's a concern. If they're working that many hours and then interacting with the public, being asked to make some critical decisions, that would be an area of interest for me.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that plays to just the general thought of what is rewarded. And it kind of goes to what Louisa was talking about promotions, et cetera. It's like, what is rewarded with promotion, with pay, and with rewards and awards and other accolades. I think it's like what gets rewarded gets reinforced. So that also plays into the conversation about culture and what people are, try to lean into versus not when you're in a organization.
Right. Thanks.
Right, and then the other piece that I can't remember if we wrote on there or not is that we would be working with Cami and looking at, what is not happening in this police department in terms of training, hiring, policy practices, and maybe there are other cities that we should be looking at, and they were doing this and they're not doing that in Santa Barbara, or maybe they are doing that in Santa Barbara, doing something in Santa Barbara that they're not doing in other cities that may be impacting negatively or positively. So that's something that I think we need to add to.
Great.
Cami on the spot again.
Yeah, maybe Cami, for all of us, can come to one of our next meetings or part of it or something like that. Oops.
Absolutely.
Okay. Whew.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gabe.
All right. So does the data and analytics group want to go, or the community outreach?
I'm gonna go ahead and say Rachel can go first if she wants to.
Community outreach it is.
I'm happy to. Is my audio functioning all right? It's been weird. Okay, awesome. Yes, okay. So the community engagement work group, we met twice in our since our last meeting, and it was Anna, Jordan, Rich, and I. Basically, we also started by getting to know each other, although we realized we all know each other pretty well, everyone that signed up for that group. So we started really just kind of, talking about the why of community engagement. A lot of the two groups we've heard from already, it's a lot of, it's a lot of research and policy and things like that. And I guess our work group really gets the the more qualitative pieces of this by looking at why we need to engage with the community. So we all agreed very strongly that the success of this whole endeavor is probably going to hinge a lot on communication and not just us communicating out to the council, but also, two-way communication, learning from the community as well as city staff, and then communicating well back out to those same stakeholders. So we basically started with looking at, who are those stakeholders? Who are the people that we either need to engage with in some specific way, like law enforcement agencies, especially, city staff, things like that. But then also, who do we need to be learning from in addition to the research that we can conduct ourselves or through NACOL? And then also the sort of third entity of who do we really need to bring along in the process? I think we all, it's one of the parts of Cammie's presentation I remember was, bringing up that there have been commissions like ours or oversight bodies who've actually had lawsuits brought against them, things like that. So obviously, we want to set up the oversight body to sort of avoid PR issues, lawsuits, communication issues, things like that. So with that in mind, we kind of narrowed our focus to just look at some priorities over the next several months, and this is the piece where we said we would align some of these with that timeline that Gabe and Anna have been working on to present to council, so we could sort of piece these along. One of the main priorities, and this is definitely one we want to engage with NACOL on discussing further, is the community climate survey on policing. So beyond what we can research from other cities, what we can't learn from that is what our community thinks about this process, thinks about law enforcement. And then we also wanted to make sure to get law enforcement's participation in the survey as well. So this is doing a broad, hopefully multilingual, accessible survey is going to be our best shot at really, getting to know how the community feels about this. And I think, we discussed some strategies we thought would be more effective, like regional strategies, working with neighborhood, community-based, and having things like, actually, guessing I'm dropping to the other bullet point, but looking at things like ambassadors, like who are people that we can engage with from different parts of the community that will help with the effort overall, but maybe specifically with helping us get broad participation in the survey as well. The next priority is we've gotten lots of presentations from city staff so far, and we anticipate engaging NACOL to do a lot of presentations for us. But we wanted to look at who are the other community stakeholders that we might want to also invite in to our sessions so that we can learn specifically from them. So that's the long list at the bottom of the document. We dropped in kind of our initial brainstorm because we want to get some feedback from the rest of the commission on who's missing. But the work group is suggesting we came up with the first priority of recommending that we invite Healing Justice to present to us for a number of reasons. One, they're one of the main impetuses of us being here, but also they are also engaged very heavily in research around this for many years now, not just since this became a reality. And so we're recommending them as one of the first community groups we invite. We also think that they would probably be quite ready to do so. So we could even invite them as early as our next commission meeting, if that's something the commission wants to move forward with. And then the third thing we discussed was presentations by probably NACOL would be the first ones we'd engage with to start with, but potentially other presentations as well for us as a commission to build our own capacity to communicate well about what we're doing. So we talked a little bit about different topics. One could be examples of community engagement. So how have other municipalities done things like climate surveys? Have they used specific kinds of community engagement? Which ones have worked, which ones haven't? And also just sort of communication strategies that other oversight bodies have engaged with. And part of this too is that, you know, this will all be for our commission's edification and learning, but hopefully we'll also be modeling and testing out some best practices that might become the eventual oversight body's best practices as well. Like, would they want to do things like regular climate surveys or you know, learning sessions with the community? Things like that might be part of our recommendation, as well as what we'll do for ourselves. Another potential topics we talked about were things like certain kinds of language and talking points for us, you know, to be equipped if folks in the community ask us questions about what we're doing as well. If you've noticed in the two presentations thus far, and this is not at all a criticism, but just pointing out there's a lot of jargon, right? Like, there's a lot of terminology that some of us can take for granted that people know, but there's a lot of terminology that people don't know. Things like asset-based, community-focused, deficit, you know, that sort of language is you know, makes sense to some people within this context, but we can't take it for granted that everybody knows all that kind of language. And so we thought, yeah, that might be a sort of learning area for us as well. I know, you know, things like restorative practices, you know, a number of different groups have brought up interest in learning about that. That's also, you know, some language around that I would love to have, and we talked about being really useful. And also some of the, I guess, inflammatory language or things that people use without always fully understanding it. Words like defunding the police, right? What does it mean to defund versus reallocate? And so I think, you know, if we as a commission are equipped really well to understand all those concepts and be able to use terminology well with each other, that'll set us up to communicate better externally as well. And then I mentioned this briefly before, but this was a, you know, great idea of how do we cultivate ambassadors within the community? So people who are going to not necessarily be, you know, 100% allies and understand fully what we're doing, but can help us reach specific groups in the community that we need to prioritize, or yeah, can sort of aid our work as the next layer out from the commission. So the discussion items on that second page there, yeah, we wanted to hear from you all. Are there other community groups that we didn't put on our initial brainstorm list? Because I think, you know, we'd like for that to be as exhaustive as possible, because that list will also be probably include a lot of organizations that could help us expand the reach of something like a climate survey. And then when we do invite people to present, we wanted to prepare them as well as possible to understand what we want from them. So if there are things like guiding questions or specific learning outcomes that we would want to pass along to groups when we invite them in. How do we want to prioritize presentations? I mean, we have a limited number of meetings together. So we've made one recommendation with Healing Justice, but yeah, we should kind of talk about how we might make those decisions. Are there any other presentations or learning resources that the commission wants? And then kind of thinking to actual action items, you know, when would we maybe want to launch something like a community climate survey? What point in that timeline makes sense? Yeah, and then you'll see the preliminary list of those stakeholders is at the bottom. And that's it.
Thank you. This is awesome. Any feedback from anyone?
I do have some.
Yep, go ahead, Mary.
One I mentioned early in the meeting, and that is the idea of us basically holding a meeting on maybe on a Saturday, or one that's more accessible to people. And again, preferably when people are able to come into a room, but if it has to be on Zoom, it's on Zoom. But really, rather than us, and I think it's important to identify some groups, but it's the people that we don't even know they're there, that, you know, kind of giving anybody a chance to come and speak. I mean, it's essentially public comment, but at a public forum. and that we would also kind of present a summary of what we're doing. I mean, we can technically do that at any meeting, but I think having a dedicated workshop essentially, and then whoever wants to come and speak, you know, just for a few minutes, but at least we know they're there and then they know we're there. I know that has worked in the past when we did a hate crime network and we went to Cabrillo Rec Center, and it was just filled with people on a rainy Saturday who wanted to come and talk. So I think that's good. And then the only other thing I would suggest in the civic sector is besides SBPD, it's the union, which is distinct. I think we do want to engage them because when we're talking about not being undermined at the end, I think that's a group. And then also in the county, you know, we've got the sheriff's department, but there's a group of the community realignment community corrections partnership, and that actually is charged with kind of shifting money to community entities. And so and they have a committees that just deal with, you know, pretrial release and things like that. So maybe getting somebody from, and I know people like Ethan Bertrand, I know represents Supervisor Hart at some of those meetings. So because I do think at some point we need to link in what happens to people when they go to jail, because as some of you may have read, there's a lot of incidents of use of force in the sheriff's department, maybe not necessarily here. And so even though we're not making recommendations for the sheriff's department, I think it's important for us to get information on kind of what goes on there. So that's all I have to say, but you guys are doing a great job.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I totally agree with sort of an open house style meeting. I've been a little surprised so far that, you know, we don't get much public comment, but then I realize, you know, on an evening like this, it's because there's a city council meeting too, right? There's too many places to show up for public comment. So yeah, that would be great. And then I think you're right too. I mean, with your last point as well, you know, can we get the climate survey to folks in the jail, you know, formerly incarcerated, certainly like systems involved individuals would be really critical to get their perspective too.
I can send you some names too of people on some of those committees.
Jacob, did you have something?
Yes, I would recommend a presentation by Tri-County GLAD, the deaf advocacy organization, and in my role as a disability advocate, we have seen most of the problem with the police involving people in the deaf community. So I think it's really important to reach out to the deaf community. I would also second that I would like hearing justice here the sooner the better, because I think there are really big impacts in our community and they should present to us to make sure we're doing as we're following the track of their leadership.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe as well, Jacob, we could follow up with you too if there's specific contacts, like individuals that you like from those organizations. That absolutely.
Thank you.
On that note, a quick clarifying question. So what might the presentations from these organizations look like? What information would we be looking to gather?
I mean, in some ways, that's exactly the kind of discussion we wanted to have with the commission, right? In terms of those guiding questions, like what do we want? Because I think some organizations would probably already have things they would present to a body like this. But I think we probably should maybe try to have some consistency across what we ask from them. So that's something we'd love to hear about, you know, have a discussion with the whole commission about.
Thank you for that. I would think, or one possible idea is you could invite for individual sessions those organizations that might already have talking points, invite them individually, but for those who this may not be the focus of their work and they might not have thought about it in depth, maybe having a just a general meeting where you invite maybe 3 or 4 of them and sort of have a panel discussion so that they can provide insight, but not necessarily feel the pressure of having to be able to carry a whole conversation about something that might be out of their depth.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Kim. Thank you.
And also, I wanted to, as far as an organization, a nonprofit, suggest Pacific Pride Foundation to be one that we look at. And one little sort of marketing thing is the climate survey. I keep thinking of that it's like for climate change. So I just wonder if, you know, there might be some confusion, you know, but maybe that's general understanding. But to your point earlier about jargon and stuff, we just might look at that.
Also an excellent point. You're right. I stumbled into my own trap, which is, yes, in higher ed at the college when we do climate surveys regularly, and it actually, even if it's a regular thing for us, it has led to confusion where people think they're going to give opinions about how to make the college more environmentally friendly. So we'll think about that. Maybe Nicole can help us with namings of surveys too.
Good stuff. But great work. Great work.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kim. I was just going to say, and on that note, just kind of using specific terms, the term disabled, if we could use person first language like individual with disability or that type of thing, that would be greatly appreciated across, you know, people who are undocumented, the individuals who are undocumented, things like that. I think that would be also much appreciated by community members.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think with the developing of the like the survey and our communications, I mean, that I feel like that's team effort for sure, yeah. Right? And yeah, is our language modeling what our values are. Thank you.
Right.
An organization suggestion that I have is Santa Barbara Trans Advocacy Network. That would be a good one to have on here.
I wanted to touch base on Mary's point about the community meeting, like open forums, because I feel like, and maybe this has been said before, I apologize if it has, but if we are to do that model, it has to be at different locations at different times to essentially provide opportunities for different areas and make it more accessible. And so I think my question then is, all right, when do we feel that that's comfortable within our timeline to have those benchmarks of inviting the community and sharing with the community or allowing them the point of feedback? Because I would imagine it would probably be several times throughout our timeline. What specific locations, like is East Side Franklin Library, like West Side Center, or, you know, like we should identify these, because thinking as a planner, we want to make sure that these are also well, we want to make sure they're of course well attended, but well publicized, if you will.
Yeah, those are some of the places I thought of, and Carrillo Rec Center.
There's up in San Roque, I don't know if there's a community center up there. Like, I think we have to look at all of our pockets somewhere on the Mesa. I don't know if that's City College.
Jordan, what I can do is work with Sam and get a comprehensive list of what's available in the city to you all, so that we have a really good idea on where we can host them around the city.
Thank you.
And we'd be happy to help facilitate that. You know, we have a number of public facilities. It's just a matter of, you know, what might fit with what the commission has in mind. So I'll work with the chair on that.
Cool.
All right, Louisa, I don't think you can't pass it to anyone else now.
All right. Hi, everyone. I know you're all exhausted. So we're the last group. We are the data analytics group. We are Gabe, Lizzie, Louisa, myself, and Rachel. We met 2 times. The second time, Lieutenant Hill graced us with his presence and gave us some great feedback. We too took the opportunity to get to know each other in a less nerve-wracking forum. Just so you know, Lizzie is a juggler. It's amazing. I hope I was okay that I shared that.
And Louisa is literally a rock star.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I play the cello in a rock band, and Gabe plays chess, and Rachel, I can't remember what you, but she's awesome. Anyway, I don't want to continue taking your time, but basically we are the group that actually chose to do analytics because we all love data. And we all came together because we are going to be the ones that are collecting the data that comes in. And we talked about how we wanted to set a foundation for our future data analysis. So in that, we discussed the different types of data that the commission would need to develop a recommendation. We also looked at current and future data collection practices in Santa Barbara. So Lieutenant Hill gave us a lot of feedback of how they're currently collecting data. And Lieutenant Hill, you'll probably correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the data collection process that's happening is really quite new. And it's still kind of coming in. And so we're excited to see what kind of data is coming in, and a lot of it will be aggregated, but that's all new, relatively new. We also agreed that in addition to focusing on the data collected in Santa Barbara, we're going to be working with NACOL, Cami, putting you on the spot again, to analyze national data trends and looking at a list of data relevant to the future oversight body. So I'm not sure if it's open. Oh yeah, feedback requested. So go down to that section and you can see already what we've been looking at. So this is something we want to talk to you all as the commission to talk about, which are the different types of data and analytics. So things like complaint data, crime comparison reports, dispatch call data, arrests disaggregated by race and ethnicity, arrests disaggregated by residency, number of mental health related incidents, Santa Barbara Police Department employee data, such as how many live in Santa Barbara versus commuting. In fact, Lieutenant Hill told us that we have somebody from Orange County who commutes up here, and many of our police department officers actually live outside of the city because of the exorbitant fees of living here. How many transfers, number and breakdown of staffing, use of force, so use of de-escalation policies, excessive force and other complaints, de-escalation reports, co-response data, so what other organizations are participating, how many calls versus responses, things like inventory, equipment, employee wellness programs, outcomes, which includes things like that, the juvenile program that's just been started, where those types of data will be coming in. I lost my place. Inventory, employee wellness, proactive contact data, overall contacts, firearm statistics, gang-related crimes, things like that. Those are all the types of data that we have requested, and we would like the commission to take a look and see, and also Cami as part of NACOL, which will be part of our next steps, what we're missing. We did also, let's see, we did also discuss how not only we have to balance the, we're all researchers, so we have to balance the quantitative versus the qualitative data, which is what which Rachel's group was talking about, and also providing the proper context for the data we analyze so that we can present as comprehensive a picture as possible. So what we meant by that was we wanted to make sure it was understood what we were asking for, so that we were getting the information that we actually wanted and understood how we could synthesize that for the commission and for our recommendations overall. I think that if we ask the questions correctly, we'll get the information back that we actually want. Is there anything else? That's pretty much where we are. We're kind of that group that's sort of waiting for data to come in, which we're very excited to look at and aggregate and, and just figure out what our next steps are. I'm going to look to my group members, Gabe and Rachel, to add anything further if I forgot anything.
I think you did a pretty good job of summarizing where we're at and kind of what we're looking for. If there's any data or information related to analytics that you are interested in, please let us know.
It's a good group. We have a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kristen. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, y'all. Good work. So I saw that you had put on here complaint data. So I think this falls under that category, but Lieutenant Hill offered up some very specific stuff like the disposition breakdown. So I'll remind you all that the dispositions are categories like sustained, unfounded, right, that are applied to a complete misconduct investigation. So not just like complaint data, but very specifically that disposition breakdown would be much appreciated if it's being offered. And then also one of the things that I'm trying to make sure that we don't lose in the conversation about different models is that there is certainly cost associated with all of them. And I don't want the conversation to be exclusively focused on the cost of the systems, but also on the cost of not having effective oversight. Because as we all know, misconduct is expensive. And often results in settlements with the police department or the city. And so information or data on what that is currently costing the city would be really advantageous, I think, in helping us make the argument for civilian oversight is that we have the potential to be proactive and save the city and the police department money.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point and something that we hadn't considered. So we will consider that further. There was one piece that I did also want to mention I had forgotten is one thing that had come out of our group is sort of a reading list of books that have been coming up. Rachel Johnson and I and Gabe were talking about how we want to be able to share these titles with you all to read. So that might be something we'll drop into the Dropbox as well that can kind of help us come up with other ideas or other thoughts that have come along. So that will also be coming to you as well. Kind of like a book club. Sorry, I'm tired. I'm getting punny.
That's great. I was also going to build on Christian's thought, and as we think of like the unintended expenses associated with all these occurrences, I wonder if there are also nonprofits who absorb some of that work. Like, you know, part of the work that they do is to maybe help people process after they've been subject maybe to police violence, or they're helping people to litigate against the police department. I don't know if these are occurrences, but if there are external resources that are used to help with this issue, that can also be quantified.
Okay, thank you. That's a great point.
Any other feedback? All right. It looks like we are done. Thank you everyone for the great reports and a great meeting. I think we do have to open up public comment. That's what Sam's coming to
Sure,
remind
let
me.
me just give me 1 second. Just there's only one attendee. Just if anybody from the public would like to speak on these working group reports, please raise your hand in the chat feature. Seeing none, Mr. Chair, I will close. We can close the public comment portion.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we are done. Sam is going to send out the Dropbox information tomorrow, so you all get your logins and we can start sharing information with one another. One thing to just anticipate is that we're going to have another commission working group update, so we can probably anticipate having something similar with just a brief write-up to inform the group where we're at. So just keep that in mind. So we'll have a little bit more time to develop that than just a week.
And should we give one last applause for Serafina Chavez, graduate from UC Santa Barbara tonight?
Yes.
She's going to watch this tomorrow, so congrats. That's
Congrats.
all.
Yay.
And with that, we will adjourn in Serafina's congratulations.
Good night,
everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Talk to you all soon.
Good night, everyone.
Night. Thanks, everyone.